This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle. Written by D.A Roberts and read to you by Cameron Buckner. The Wild Hunt is a unit of the United States Army, created to counter the threat from paranormal creatures that the government is not willing to admit exist due to the level of panic which would be caused in the general public. This operation exists outside the normal chain of command, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President. Considered an off-the-books black bag operation, the team is not officially known to exist and is still publicly referred to as a training division. Prologue. 0900 hours, 02 May. Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington. Lieutenant General Joshua Dalton called the meeting to order. They were gathered in the largest conference room at the headquarters of the Wild Hunt. There were representatives from a dozen countries with just as many different uniforms on display seated around the room. "I'd like to thank you all for coming," said Dalton. "You already know why we're here." Murmurs and heads were nodding around the conference room. Major Clark was seated at the side of the room next to Lieutenant Colonel Sanders. Command Sergeant Major Hammond was seated on the other side of Saunders. "I'd like to know why we're here," whispered Clark. "You know why we're here, Dan," said Saunders, grinning. "Well, okay," whispered Clark. "I know what the meeting is about, but with the General here, our presence is kind of superfluous." "The General moves in mysterious ways," whispered Saunders. "Relax and have a dip," added CSM Hammond. "And while you're at it, give me one." Clark chuckled as he fished out a can of long-cut chewing tobacco and put a large pinch in his lip. Handing the can to Hammond, he grinned as the older warrior put a dip and sighed contently. While technically keeping his word to his wife, Hammond had promised to stop buying tobacco. He said nothing about accepting it if it was offered to him. "Everyone here today is aware of the existence of creatures that modern science does not recognize," began Dalton. "Some of them are cryptids or unknown animals, while others are straight out of folklore. Regardless of their origins and despot claims to be contrary, we know for a fact that these creatures are real. They are real and they prey on humans. This is exactly why my team was originally founded. This is the reason all of you are here." Around the room, senior officers exchanged dark looks, but no one denied what he was saying. "Due to the increase in violent encounters, not only here in the United States," said Dalton, "but throughout the planet, the notion of fielding an international response team was brought up." Activating a smart screen on the wall brought up the global map. There were numerous points in green and red illuminated across the globe. "On this map," said Dalton, "green indicates confirmed attacks, and red indicates confirmed human kills. As you can see, this represents a significant number of human-monster encounters, with more than half being fatal confrontations. That caused murmurs to run through the group. Most of these encounters are either in or close to the countries you all represent," Dalton said. "Some are in places where none of us have any jurisdiction. We have no data on countries that we do not consider allies. You will note that while we do know that such creatures exist, there are no indicators in Russia, China, or the majority of the Middle East." Dalton paused for dramatic effect while they all studied the map. "Some of you have had your own encounters with creatures that my team has fought," said Dalton, "and some of you have only faced smaller threats. My question to you is this: how many accounts have gone unreported due to fear from the witness or the fact that no one survived to report it? How many deaths could have been prevented if someone had reacted to the sightings? Ladies and gentlemen, I intend to react." That drew nods of agreement from the assembled crowd. We've invited you all here and asked that you contribute to an international response team, said Dalton. One that is capable of responding to any Allied request on any continent, in any environment, in any weather. When I suggested this idea to the Joint Chiefs, I didn't expect it to be accepted as quickly as it was. It's unprecedented how quickly our governments agree and sent representatives. Members of special forces and SWAT teams and scholars and detectives were selected for this team. And since the team will have to be far more self-reliant than ever before, we have chosen a broad range of skill sets to complement any mission. No one spoke. General Dalton had the entire room listening to his every word. The wild hunt is broken up into 4 territorial zones with 4 teams assigned per zone, said Dalton. This gives us extraordinary mobility to respond to threats throughout the United States. And since we will be making Team Odin our test team for international response, we will be adding a team to the U.S. roster to fill in for the interim. If this experiment works as well as we are hoping, it will become a model for all the teams with additional support from allied nations. He paused to take a sip of water. You have all been selected from allied nations with teams similar in missions to ours to become part of Team Odin, he said. This team will be led by Colonel Levi Saunders and Major Daniel Clark. We chose Team Odin because of their extensive experience with these types of threats. We've selected the following countries to join Team Odin as the first international response team. For ease of introduction, I will use their American equivalents and rank. Pausing for effect, he pointed at a group and their members stood to be recognized. From Canada's Joint Task Force 2, he began, I present Sergeant Henry Dubois, Master Corporal William LeMay, Corporal Dickie Haviland, and Corporal Liam O'Connor. All 4 of them have already completed a mission with Team Odin when they had to pursue a Wendigo across the Canadian border. Applause sounded from the group and Clark smiled. He knew they were all good choices. From Japan's Special Forces Group and Special Assault Teams, said Dalton, First Lieutenant Itami Yuju, Inspector Shino Kurabashi, and former Sergeant-turned-Shinto priest Ken Nakamura. There was more applause. From Peru's Special Forces and Commandos, added Dalton, Captain Santiago Gamara and Sergeant Alejandro de la Cruz, and from Poland's J.W. Grom, Sergeant First Class Kazimierz Jaracki and Staff Sergeant Vincent Flarkowski. Cheers rose from the groups. From Norway's Special Forces, said Dalton, Captain Oystein Mork and Staff Sergeant Anita Hagen. From Germany's GSG-9, we have First Lieutenant Amelia Koch, Staff Sergeant Alfred Lang, Sergeant First Class Dietrich Kaiser, Sergeant Boulder Wolf, and First Sergeant Andreas Hyde. Both groups snapped to perfect, crisp attention as they stood. From England, said Dalton, representing the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, Special Air Service and Special Boat Service, Joint Special Forces Aviation Wing, and the Special Response Team of the Metropolitan Police Service, I present Warrant Officer Noah Davidson, Sergeant Ryan Ball, Sergeant David Connolly, Petty Officer Harry Atkinson, Captain Nicole Bailey, and Inspector Tegan Miracle. The members of the British delegation stood as a unit and saluted General Dalton. He returned the salute before continuing. From Ireland's Garda Emergency Response Unit, said Dalton, may I present Inspector Aaron Fitzgerald and Sergeant Thomas O'Cleary. From Italy's Carabinieri Corps, Sergeant Giovanni De Luca, Corporal Antonio Russo, and Corporal Piero Costa. From Spain's Special Operations Command, Sergeant Mateo Gato Negro Lopez. Lopez stood and waved casually with a smile on his face. The Irish stood and looked around the room like they were studying the faces. From Israel, said Dalton, we have representatives from the Sayeret Matkal, the fabled Unit 669, and the Mossad. I present First Lieutenant Malachi Beer, Second Lieutenant Hannah Aaron, Staff Sergeant Alexander Altscher, Rabbi Benny Levin, and Sarah Majid. A few people exchanged concerned glances at the mention of the Mossad. And from the Vatican's Fraternitatem Vigilantium, or Brotherhood of the Vigilant, said Dalton, I present siblings Matthias, Marcus, and Magdalena Giovanni. The triplet stood and nodded at the crowd. Matthias looked around the room quickly and then smiled at Marcus. What? Whispered Marcus. I'm just happy that there'll be an attractive woman on this team, he said, grinning. I get bored quickly with a group that was just men. Well, Magdalena is here, said Marcus sarcastically. I meant women other than her, replied Matthias. We're descended from the Medici, not the Moravians. Magdalena chuckled and Marcus just shook his head. I will dismiss the members whose names I've just called, said General Dalton. You can go with Lieutenant Colonel Saunders and Major Clark. You'll be accompanying them to Fort Leonard Wood within the hour for team assignment and training. Senior staff will remain here with me to discuss logistics and equipment. Saunders and Clark got up and led the group out of the room and onto the parade ground at the back of the building. Everyone form up, shouted Clark. Quickly, everyone assembled in a loose formation, each group sticking close to each member. The Giovannis took a spot at the end and stood there, making no attempt to form up a military formation. Once they were settled and in place, Saunders strolled out to the middle of them and looked them over. All right, ladies and gentlemen, he said, pacing back and forth. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Levi Saunders. Welcome to the Wild Hunt and Team Odin. We're still formalizing who will be assigned to what team, so final assignments won't be announced until we're back at base. Thank you all for volunteering for this assignment. I look forward to getting to know you all and putting this new team to the test. I want you all to grab your gear and be back here in 30 minutes. We'll be heading straight to the airstrip. We're wheels up in 1 hour. Don't make me come looking for you. Dismissed. With that, they all headed for their vehicles parked at the end of the building that held their baggage. Within 15 minutes, all of them had returned except for the Giovannis. They arrived just before the 30-minute deadline without any personal gear. Where's your gear? Asked CSM Hammond. We have our own plane, said Matthias. I'll need clearance to land at Fort Leonard Wood. It has all of our gear on board. Hammond frowned and shook his head. He knew it was going to be interesting dealing with the Vatican's delegation. They were the only group who hadn't been invited to participate with the new international team. The Vatican had flexed its considerable political muscle and had its own team placed on Team Odin. General Dalton had protested, but had been overruled by SecDef himself. All right, folks, roared CSM Hammond. Grab your gear and board the buses at the end of the parade field. As everyone headed for the buses, Saunders motioned for Clark, and CSM Hammond and Gideon to hang back. Once everyone was out of earshot, he turned and looked at them. We're going to have our work cut out for us, he said, shaking his head. They might be the best of the best where they come from, but it's our job to find out just how good they are. If any of them can't cut it, we'll put them on the plane back to whichever country they're from. Well, some of them are academics and scholars, said CSM Hammond. They'll be assigned to my team, said Saunders. First-line combatants go to Clark and Hernandez. We need to know if they're capable of running and gunning with our best. Well, we'll hit the ground running first thing in the morning, said Clark. I'm looking forward to seeing if Sergeant De La Cruz from Peru is as good of a sniper as they claim. I hear he put a hell of a dent in the cartels trying to move product into Peru. So much so that they put a $10 million bounty on his head. I'll put him on the range with Valkyrie. If she says he's good, I'll believe it. All right, gentlemen, said Saunders. Let's work on team assignments during the flight. Things are going to be different when we're in another country, and we've got to be ready. How long do we have to train before we go active? Asked CSM Hammond. I told him we'd need 3 to 6 months to fully integrate and evaluate all of them, said Saunders. But General Dalton wants us deployable by the end of the week, so that's that. Well, shit, said CSM Hammond. I guess we better get our asses in gear then. End of the week? Asked Clark, incredulous. We'll still be figuring out who can cut it for weeks. We can't possibly be ready to deploy that fast. Our orders stand, said Saunders. I already argued our case with Dalton. He was told to be ready by SecDef. There are a lot of eyes on us. Also, keep your eye on the Vatican group. I have no idea where their loyalties are, and none of them have any military experience. Oh, yeah, said Clark. What could possibly go wrong? Careful what you wish for, said Saunders. We might just find out. I don't trust the Vatican team, said Hammond. We won't be their first loyalty. Well, that's safe to assume, said Saunders. If they screw up, document it. I want to have the paper in place before I try to toss them. Yes, sir, said Clark, shaking his head. Yeah, this is going to be great. Chapter 1, Deep Water. 1430 hours, 10 May. Lago Nahualapi, Argentina. 5 people worked at a relentless pace to bring boxes of equipment and provisions onto the 80-foot Burger flush-deck motor yacht. The gleaming white hull stood out in stark contrast to the dark waters of Lago Nahualapi. The bustling port of the beautiful lakeside city of San Carlos de Bariloche was the perfect backdrop for the picturesque setting. "Be careful with those crates," snapped a rather bookish-looking young man with dark hair and round glasses. He wore denim jeans with blue sneakers, a teal T-shirt with a khaki vest that had numerous pockets. "Those cameras cost more than my apartment," he added. "Please don't drop them in the water." "Relax, Rodrigo," said an attractive blonde wearing skin-tight blue yoga pants, deck shoes, and a black hoodie with the shield logo of the River Plate football team. "You're going to give yourself a heart attack." "Look, Carmen," said Rodrigo, "I'm the producer, which means I'm responsible for every piece of equipment on this expedition. All you have to do is stand in front of the camera and look pretty." "Oh, you think I'm pretty?" she replied, grinning. Rodrigo sighed and shook his head. "Look, little brother," she said, her smile lighting up her face. "Try to relax and calm down. This is just the beginning of our 7-day expedition. You're going to have a stroke." "Well, that's easy for you to say," he said, shaking his head. "Cazador de Monstros is the #1 rated show in its time slot. There's a lot of pressure on us to get usable footage of Nahualito. We might even get into the American audience with this show if we play our cards right." "Why would the Americans be interested in Nahualito?" she said. "Most Americans have never heard of the monster of Lake Nahualapi." "Then we will get footage and tell the story," said Rodrigo, grinning. "This could be our ticket to real money. If we're picked up by American television, we're set." "You know, we're not doing so bad now," she said, shaking her head. "I just bought a condo on the River Plate, and you just bought a new Jaguar. Not too bad for a show we came up with in college that just caught on." "Well, there are only so many monsters for us to hunt in Argentina," he said. "I want to go to America and film the Bigfoot or the Dogman or even the Chupacabra." "You do realize that the Chupacabra has been seen here, right?" she chided. "We don't have to go far to find sightings." "I know," he said, "but to film it in America, I want to work for the Travel Channel or the History Channel." "One step at a time, little brother," she said. "Let's worry about getting footage of Nahualito. You find the monster, and I'll sell it to our viewers. Our ratings will go through the roof." "Let's just hope our crew of idiots can pull this off," said Rodrigo, nodding at the group who was carrying the last of the crates onto the boat. "So, what's the plan?" asked Carmen. Once we leave, we'll run the sonar down the lake, said Rodrigo. Parts of this lake are over 500 meters deep. There are plenty of places for monster like Nahualito to hide. We'll continue along the lake looking for anything large enough to be the monster, and once we find something, we launch the underwater drones. Hopefully, it will come to the surface and we can get footage of you in front of it. And if not, we'll green screen you in front of it for the show. As long as it doesn't try to eat us, she said. I've seen horror movies like that. There are no reports of Nahualito attacking or eating anyone, said Rodrigo. But there's lots of people who have gone missing on the lake over the years, she said. People who were never found. Well, this is a deep lake, said Rodrigo. Boats sink sometimes. It's deep enough that divers can't go to the bottom to find the bodies. So don't worry, no monsters are going to try to eat you. Well, I hope you're right, she said with a chuckle. Now let's get aboard and get underway. The sooner we start getting usable footage, the better. They headed aboard the motor yacht and went below the decks to store their gear. The boat had been rented by the studio for a week, and it came with its own crew. There was a captain named Miguel Sandoval, a cook named Diego, and 2 deckhands named Raul and Luis. They would take care of the boat, leaving them free to film and look for the monster. The boat was big enough that they could all sleep comfortably, even if they had to share cabins. Carmen shared a stateroom with Paula, one of the videographers. Rodrigo shared another stateroom with Marco, the other videographer. Their sound technician was named Alejandro, and he was the only one of the crew that had been with them since college. He shared a stateroom with Tomas and the team computer expert. Tomas would be responsible for mixing the footage and layering the sound into a usable product. He was also the one who knew how to use the sonar equipment. By the time they had put away their gear and returned to the deck, Captain Sandoval was casting off and idling away from the dock. Once he was clear from the other boats, he expertly throttled up and headed out of the port and into the center of the lake. Once they were safely away from the harbor and into deep water, he slowed to an idle. "We're in the channel," he called down from the bridge. "Time to drop your sonar." Tomas opened one of the crates and began pulling out the sonar gear. The sonar probe looked like a yellow missile that would be towed beneath the boat, pinging the area with active side-scan sonar. Once it was assembled and ready, he plugged in the leads and secured the sonar probe to the end of the cable. He picked a spot on the side of the boat that would allow him to deploy the sonar without any risk of it becoming fouled in the propellers. Once the yellow probe, called a fish, was in the water, Tomas activated the screen on his laptop to begin recording the sonar data that was being transmitted back to him. Almost immediately, data began flooding the screen. Tomas continued to play out the fish and adjusted it to a depth of 50 meters. The depth of Lago Nahualapi ranged as far as 500 meters in places. Even at that depth, the sensitive sonar should pick out movements of a creature as large as Nahualito was reported to be. "We're getting good imaging," said Tomas, without looking up. "The sonar is sensitive, and if anything that big is moving within the range, we will see it." "I certainly hope so," said Rodrigo. "That thing cost us a fortune." "Technically," said Carmen, "it cost the studio a fortune. We didn't pay for it." "Yeah, but it came out of our budget," said Rodrigo. "Here's hoping it's worth it." "If Nahualito is down there," said Alejandro, "Tomas will find it." "I hope we find it soon," said Rodrigo. "Time is money." "This lago is more than 80 kilometers long," said Tomas. "This won't be quick, not if you want me to be thorough. And if we go too fast, we could pass right by it, and the sonar might not pick it up." "Then let's not go too fast," said Carmen, opening a cooler, retrieving a beer from the ice. "Starting a little early, sis," said Rodrigo. "It's the air on the lake," she said, smiling as she took a sip. "It just begs for a good drink." "Toss me one of those," said Alejandro. "Me too," said Tomas. "Godless heathens," muttered Rodrigo, heading toward the bridge. Climbing the ladder to the bridge, Rodrigo found Captain Sandoval at the helm. "How's it going, Captain?" asked Rodrigo. "Weather looks good," said Sandoval without looking away from the lake ahead of him. "We're in a deep channel, and if no idiots in speedboats or on those stupid jet skis get in our way, we should have smooth sailing." "What's the course?" asked Rodrigo. "Already adjusted our cruising speed based on your sonar operator's specification," said Sandoval. "At current speed, we should reach the far end of the lake just before nightfall. We'll anchor there for the night and then sweep back down the lake tomorrow." "Unless we see something," said Rodrigo. "That's right," said Sandoval sarcastically as he shook his head. "You don't believe in Nahualito?" asked Rodrigo. Sandoval turned toward him with a smile. "I've been fishing and boating this lago since I was a small boy," said Sandoval. "I was born just a few miles from this very spot. I've never seen anything that even remotely looks like a monster." "So you think we're wasting our time?" asked Rodrigo, a bit perturbed. "Not at all," said Sandoval. "I've heard a lot of stories about Nahualito, some from people I know to be honest and not prone to tell tall tales. They saw something, but I don't know what it was. I've never seen it, and besides, you're paying me to pilot the boat up and down the lago while you look for it. What I believe is irrelevant. I'm here to do my job and nothing more." "Well, what if we find it?" asked Rodrigo. "What then?" "Then I will be the first to congratulate you," said Sandoval. "Then, as soon as we get back to the port, I'll change the name of my business from Lago Excursiones to Nahualito Excursiones." Rodrigo chuckled. "I wouldn't blame you," he replied. "If we get footage, you and your crew will be famous." "So to answer your question," said Sandoval, "I might not be a believer, but I certainly hope you find it. It'll be good for business." "Well, that's good enough for me," said Rodrigo. "I'm going below for a bit to check the equipment. If you need me, just call." "I will," answered Sandoval. "If you need me, this is where I will be." Rodrigo smiled and headed back down to the deck. Most of the crew was gathered around Tomas and the laptop. "Did you find something already?" asked Rodrigo, his eyes open wide. "I caught a blip," said Tomas. "It was only there for a second, and then it was gone. Whatever it was big and moving amazingly fast." "Which direction did it go?" asked Rodrigo. "The same direction we're going," said Tomas, smiling. "We'll catch it eventually. It can only run so far." Rodrigo looked excited as he, too, crowded around the tiny laptop. Carmen handed him a beer, and he opened it without comment, sipping as he watched. "My God," whispered Rodrigo excitedly. "We're really going to pull this off." No one spoke. They were all enthralled with the video. And after several minutes of staring at nothing on their return, there was a ping. "What's that?" asked Alejandro. "Contact," said Tomas. "Depth is just over 300 meters. And from the looks of it, it's about 20 or 25 feet long, and it's moving quickly." There was another audible ping on the audio output, and then, in an instant, the image seemed to move rapidly and shrink. "Did it just vanish?" asked Rodrigo. "No," said Tomas. "It just dove over 100 meters in just a few seconds. It disappeared in the clutter of rocks and plants at the bottom of the lago." "Shit," hissed Rodrigo. "Can you say for certain that was Nahualito?" "Unless there's a pod of whales living in an isolated and landlocked freshwater lake," said Tomas. "Then what else could it be? It was incredibly fast and it dove deep. It's using the topography of the bottom to confuse the sonar. It knows we're looking for it." "For the love of God," said Rodrigo. "Please tell me someone got this on film." "Every word," said Paula, smiling from around her camera. "This thing is smart," said Tomas, almost under his breath. "How would it know to avoid the sonar?" "Probably because this boat is loud and it hurts its ears," offered Carmen. "Maybe," said Tomas, "but this feels different. It's not just reacting to the sound. It's going places deliberately that will confuse the signal. That's not normal behavior for an animal." "It is if that animal doesn't want to be found," said Rodrigo. Other expeditions have had similar results when using sonar. We just got better footage than they did. The reason no one has found this thing is because it knows how to hide." "If you say so," said Tomas. "I just think we need to be careful. We don't want to back this thing into a corner." "I'll keep that in mind," said Rodrigo. "Now let's get something more than a big blip on the sonar. I want images of Nahualito. I want to make the front page of every newspaper in Argentina." "There it is again," said Tomas, pointing at the screen. "It got closer to us this time." "Let's get a camera in the water," said Rodrigo. "On it," said Marco. "I'll get the underwater footage. Paula, you keep the camera running on the sonar readout." Marco quickly unpacked the underwater ROV, or remotely operated vehicle. It was a small submersible with multiple cameras mounted to it. He carefully lowered it into the water by the tether and activated the control module. Once online, he ran a quick function check before diving the tiny submersible into the dark water of Nahualapi. "Cameras are feeding good images," said Marco, "but visibility is only about 20 feet. If it's out there, it's going to have to get close so we can film it." "Sonar contact!" yelled Tomas. Everyone turned to see if they could get a glimpse of whatever had caused the unusual reserved Tomas to react so excitedly. "Oh my God," said Tomas. "It came within 50 meters of us and then it dove deep again." "Where?" asked Paula. Tomas pointed, and she ran to the side of the ship and began filming, looking for any sign of something large enough moving through the water. She panned back and forth and was about to turn toward the bow of the ship when something rolled on the surface. It was only there for a couple of seconds, but she knew it had been in the frame. Whatever it was, she had it on film. "Hey guys," she shouted, "I just got something." "Keep filming in case it comes back," yelled Rodrigo. "We'll review it later." "I got you," she whispered, panning the area where she'd seen it. She knew that the high-definition camera was recording at 60 frames per second. If there was any detail to be seen, this camera picked it up. She could barely contain her excitement at seeing it. If she captured the first high-def footage of Nahualito, then she was going to be famous. They all were. This would propel their show to all new heights. The next few hours passed with nothing on the sonar and only fish breaking the surface of the lake. Paula knew there was going to be a lot of useless footage, but all she could think about was the few seconds of footage that would reveal the thing that came to the surface. Taking a seat in the main cabin, she removed the memory card from the digital recorder and inserted it into her laptop. Rodrigo handed her a cold bottle of water and sat beside her. Paula didn't drink, so he brought her the next best thing. "Give me a second to find the right spot," she said, bringing up the video file into her editing software. Rodrigo said nothing, waiting patiently as he sipped on his beer. Tomas was still out on the deck watching the sonar feed, and Marco was with him to film anything new that came up. Most of the others were working on their own projects, except for Carmen. She grabbed a jar of queso and a bag of chips, and then took a seat to watch the footage. Secretly, she suspected that Paula had just caught a fish on film, but she wanted to be there if it turned out to be something else. Carmen dipped a chip into the thick queso and put it into her mouth just as the footage came up. Immediately, she choked and spat it onto the floor. Rodrigo didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the screen. Paula quickly paused the image and used the software to roll back the footage to when the thing first crested the top of the water. "Oh my God!" shouted Carmen. "What the hell is that?" "It's not big enough to be Nahualito," said Paula. "It's too big to be a fish unless it's a freaking huge one." Rodrigo didn't say anything. He just stared at the image in silence. They were looking at a partially obscured head as it emerged from the water. The skin looked to be gray near the top and white on the underside, and the mouth seemed to be full of serrated teeth that came to a nasty point. The eye that seemed to be in the process of nictating as a second eyelid rolled away from the black, lifeless eye. "Is that a shark?" asked Rodrigo. Paula rolled the film to the next frame. It was moving fast. She got a decent image of what looked to be gill slits, just like on a shark. Gill slits, she said, pointing at the screen. That's not any fish that's supposed to be in this lake. Rolling forward, she saw it as it slipped back beneath the dark water. Just for a moment, they could see what looked like a shoulder and a part of the upper arm. That looks almost like a person, said Rodrigo. What is it? Is it a shark or is it a man? The next frame was almost obscured by water, but they could see part of what looked like a tattoo. Freeze there, said Rodrigo. Paula froze the film with the image centered. It was blurry and partially obscured by the water, but it was a tattoo. Can you make that out? Said Rodrigo. I tried to clean it up a little, said Paula. I don't expect much. It could take days at the lab to clear it up completely, but I'll do what I can. Paula played with the sharpness and contrast and then the saturation and hue. And after several moments, she was able to clear it enough to see it was some type of shield motif with what looked like a trident in the center. And above it was the letters M-E-K. What the hell is that? Asked Carmen. What the hell are we looking at? I don't know, said Rodrigo, but it's not Nahualito. No, it's not, agreed Paula. This is something new. This is something out of a horror movie. Paula isolated the image and did a screen capture of it, and then took the partial image and ran a search for possible matches. When the results came, they all froze and stared at the screen. The shield image was a unit patch from World War II. It was a unit of the German Marine Einsatzkommando, the Kampfschwimmergruppe of the Kriegsmarine. This can't be possible, said Paula. That's a unit crest from Nazi Germany, like the Kriegsmarine version of the U.S. Navy SEALs. No one is going to believe this, said Carmen. They're going to say we faked the video. This is completely unbelievable. Not as much as you might think, big sister, said Rodrigo. I took a history class in college. The professor claimed that at the end of World War II, a lot of high-ranking Nazi officers fled Germany and came here. Supposedly, they were helped by Juan Perón. There is a theory that Hitler survived Berlin and came here. How? Asked Carmen. They found his body in the bunker. Hitler had numerous body doubles, said Rodrigo. Duplicates that were surgically altered to be able to pass as him for security reasons. They think the real one made it out of Germany and lived in a house on this very lake in Analco. It's at the far end of the lake. He supposedly survived until sometime in the 1960s when he died, leaving Eva Braun with 2 daughters. No way, said Carmen. That's not possible, is it? It's very possible, said Rodrigo. Maybe even likely. Nazi artifacts are discovered just a few years ago in a house not far from here. Then what the hell is this thing in the water? Asked Carmen. I wish I knew, said Rodrigo, but if it has a tattoo, then it only makes sense that it's a human, maybe a man in a suit. That's not a suit, said Paula. I've never seen a wetsuit with gill slits. Besides, hypothermia would set in within minutes. That water is too cold to dive in for any length of time. No one is going to believe this, said Carmen. And we're not going to tell them, said Rodrigo. Not just yet. We need better footage to back this up. I don't want to go public with anything until we're sure we're not being hoaxed. This could all be an elaborate fake to fool our show. We've been all over the local news saying we would be filming here. This could be a local trying to ruin our reputation. So for now, we keep this to ourselves, okay? All right, said Paula. Fine, said Carmen angrily. But this is too big to sit on forever. Oh, I intend to use this footage, said Rodrigo. And if we can find a hidden Nazi connection to the Analco house, then we've just stumbled on to a much bigger story than Nahualito. This could be picked up by every television station on the planet. This could change history. Paula began making copies of the files and placing them in their secure drive on the cloud. What are you doing? Asked Rodrigo. I'm making backups, said Paula. The last thing we want is to have a power surge and wipe out our data, or for water to short something out and lose that footage. I'm making a copy of everything from this point on, full back up to the cloud. That's a good call, said Rodrigo, taking out his cell phone. Who are you calling? Asked Carmen. I'm calling Juan Carlo in Buenos Aires, he replied. I want him to look at the footage and do some research on the history. If there really is a Nazi connection to this area, I want to know as much about it as possible. Well, that's probably a good idea, said Carmen. 2 hours later, they were slowly motoring through the remote area of the lake when Tomas called for everyone. I've got a sonar contact, he shouted. It's big and it's coming right at us. Everyone crowded around the small screen and saw a large blip moving rapidly toward the boat. This thing is huge, exclaimed Rodrigo. Is it going to ram us? Asked Carmen, looking around nervously. Then the blip broke apart into about a dozen smaller blips. Shit, hissed Tomas. It's just a school of fish. If they're fish, they're pretty big fish, said Alejandro. 2 or 3 meters, I'd guess, said Tomas. Do fish in this lake get that big? Well, I don't know, said Carmen. Could they be dolphins or something? Dolphins are saltwater sea creatures, said Tomas. This is all fresh water with no access to the ocean. It can't be dolphins. One of the blips swerved and came right at the sonar fish. Just as it reached it, the signal cut out and the screen went black. We've lost contact with the sonar array, said Tomas. What the hell happened? I'll pull it in and see, said Alejandro, grabbing the cables and starting to pull the sonar back to the boat. He began cranking the winch that would pull the cable back. This doesn't feel right, Alejandro said. It's too light. Tomas left the computer and came over to help. Looking down into the dark water, they saw the cable end coming into view. The sonar array was gone. The cable had been snapped, and the sonar fish had either been destroyed by impact or was on its way to the bottom of the lake. It's gone, shouted Tomas, turning back toward the others. Alejandro saw something floating on the water where the cables had just emerged, and leaning down, he tried to reach it. The deck of the boat was only a few feet above the water, and the surface was just out of his reach. Leaning farther out, he looked quizzically as his reflection appeared distorted. His features appeared washed out and gray, and his eyes seemed black as the water. He stared at the odd face that was staring back at him without blinking. He cocked his head to the side, and it mimicked the movement. He reached out, and just as his fingers were about to touch the odd reflection of his hand, the gray hand shot out of the water and grabbed his wrist. The hand was far larger than his own and wrapped around his forearm and nearly covered it from wrist to elbow. He opened his mouth to scream, and it yanked him down into the dark water with tremendous force. He didn't have time to shout a warning. As it pulled him deeper and deeper into the water, he strained to hold what little air he'd managed to take in before he went under. The cold was painful, and he felt like a million needles were poking into his skin. When it was dark enough that he could barely see a foot in front of his face, the creature pulled him up in front of it. The monster looked gray as an overcast sky, but darker on his back than on its chest. It was twice his size, and he knew it wasn't human. And when it smiled, it revealed a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. The thought struck Alejandro that they were just like shark's teeth. That couldn't be right, could it? This thing looked almost human, but it still had features of a shark. His lungs were burning, and he tried to kick to the surface, but it held him fast. Just when he felt his lungs were going to burst, the smile on the creature's face faded, and he saw the dark eyes roll back into its head, just like a shark before it attacked. He opened his mouth to scream, but he felt those serrated teeth sink into the flesh of his throat. He felt the warmth of his blood as it poured out of him, slightly heating the water. First one, and then another, and then 3 more of the creatures tore into him, ripping flesh from bone and biting off smaller bones like fingers and toes, hands and feet. And even though he was close to passing out from the lack of air and loss of blood, he understood. He was being devoured by a pack of shark men, and that thought terrified him more than dying. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't live long enough to ponder it. Seconds later, the creatures dropped the bones and other remnants, letting them fall into the dark depths below. They swam in place for a moment, looking back and forth at each other before turning their attention upward. There was a boat full of food just waiting for them, and they were hungry. They were always hungry. Chapter 2. Choice Words. 1300 hours, 14 May, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, USA. Clark was standing beside the parade field behind the team offices. He was covered in sweat and dirt, having just completed the obstacle course. Teams 2 and 4 were running through their paces in the field in front of him, and some of them were running while others were performing PT or physical training in the sand pits. Team 1 and 3 were at the firing range. For the last 13 days, they'd been running Team Odin through hell. And so far, none of the troops from the other countries had complained or attempted to fall out or quit. They were all physically fit and competent with weapons. That much was already known. And now it was time to push their endurance. "How's it looking, boss?" asked Gideon, handing Clark a bottle of water. "Thanks, Sergeant Major," said Clark, accepting the water with a nod. After taking a long pull from it, he sighed and splashed some of it on his face before looking over at Gideon. He was just as dirty and sweaty as Clark, only Gideon seemed to be thoroughly enjoying himself. "So far so good," said Clark. "Valkyrie says De La Cruz is wicked with a sniper rifle. He's going to be a hell of an asset." "Well, that's good," said Gideon. "What about the Japanese contingent?" "Well, I can't speak for the 2 on teams 1 and 3, said Clark. "But Nakamura is outstanding. I think he could run for days." "Good," said Gideon. "I don't think we're going to be disappointed with the skill level of any of these people. I think our only real test will be in a fight. How they handle combat will tell us everything." "But then it'll be too late," said Clark. "That has been the dilemma of every commander since the time of the Roman army," said Gideon with a sardonic smile. "Probably even before." "Well, I'll take your word for it," said Clark, returning the grin. "So what's next?" asked Gideon. "Break 'em up into teams," said Clark. "Hand-to-hand combat drills in the pit. You take one, I'll take one, Gray Eagle gets one, Murdoch gets one, Hernandez gets one, and Sergeant Major Reese gets one. Give them a short break so they can hydrate before we get started." "Got it, boss," said Gideon, nodding. "I'll make it happen." Before he walked off, Specialist Wilder walked out of the office building and approached. "Sorry to interrupt, sir," she said, "but do you know where to find Colonel Saunders?" "I hear he makes great fried chicken," said Gideon, smirking as he walked off. "You bastard," chuckled Clark. "I'm never going to get that out of my head now." "Well, you can blame Margolin," said Gideon. "He's the one I heard it from." Wilder chuckled as Gideon walked away. "He's at the range with teams 1 and 3, said Clark, shaking his head. "Why, what's up?" "They want him and you at headquarters on the double, sir," she said. "All right, I'll send for him," said Clark. "Did they say why they wanted us to report?" "General Dalton's plane is scheduled to land in a few minutes," she said, glancing toward the headquarters building. "My best guess, sir, is that they want you there as he arrives. Their exact words were, 'most Ricky tick.'" "Got it," said Clark. "Thank you." Wilder headed inside while Clark glanced around and spotted a familiar face. "Margolin!" he shouted. Margolin's head popped out of the crowd and he headed for Clark. Snapping to attention, he fired off a quick salute. "You called, sir," said Margolin. "Yeah," said Clark. "Go grab the Humvee in front of my office and go to the range. Get Colonel Saunders and get him back here as fast as you can." "Can I assume that he won't have time to stop for some chicken, sir?" asked Margolin. Clark suppressed a chuckle. "No, we most certainly do not," said Clark. "I need him here in 10 minutes. Now go." Margolin ran to the front of the building. Seconds later, he heard the engine of the Humvee start up. Clark started to turn toward him when he realized what he'd done. Margolin knew the fastest way to the range was through the woods, not by the road. The road would take him at least 10 minutes to get there. Clark pressed his hand against his forehead as the Humvee bounced through the grass and shot across the parade field, scattering soldiers in its wake. He didn't run over anyone, but he came close a few times. Bouncing onto the track, he headed down the foot trail that they used to march to the range. The only good thing was that he shouldn't have any trouble getting Saunders back in the allotted time. Well, shit, muttered Clark. I need to remember to be more specific with that idiot. Heading to the office, Clark briefly considered grabbing a fresh uniform and a shower, but thought better of it. He knew that they'd better be heading to the HQ as soon as Saunders arrived. He took a moment to wash his hands and his face and then got another bottle of water to drink. 4 minutes later, Margolin bounced back across the parade field and parked in front of the office building. As Clark exited the building, Saunders was climbing out of the Humvee. "Did you authorize him to drive through the goddamn parade field?" asked Saunders, jerking his thumb at Margolin. Margolin only smiled innocently. "Well, sort of," said Clark. "Next time I'll have to be more specific." Saunders sighed. Command Sergeant Major Hammond climbed out of the back seat with a bewildered look on his face. He put his cover on and shot Margolin a sour look. "All right, what's the goddamn important that you had to send Evel Knievel here to pick me up?" asked Saunders. "That little bastard almost killed us," said Hammond, shaking his head. "Almost, Command Sergeant Major," said Margolin, grinning. "Almost." "They want us at HQ," said Clark. "General Dalton should be here any minute." "Well, let's go," said Saunders. As they headed for the headquarters building, Clark took out his cell phone and sent a quick text. Slipping his phone back in his pocket, he grinned but said nothing. Moments later, behind them, they heard Margolin shout, "Seriously, sir?" "Fine." He glanced back and saw Margolin drop and start doing push-ups. Clark took out his phone and showed the screen to Saunders and Hammond. He sent Margolin 3 words: "Embrace the suck." The 3 of them were chuckling as they walked into headquarters and were directed immediately to the conference room. Once inside, they saw Colonel Boudreaux and Lieutenant Colonel Stratton already there. They were wearing their Class A uniforms. "Good Lord, Levi," said Boudreaux. "You look like shit. Why aren't you in your dress uniform?" "Well, I was under the impression you wanted us here fast," said Saunders. "We were in the field training with our teams." Stratton shook her head and said nothing. "We can go shower and get into our Class A's," said Saunders. "We'll be back in about an hour." "That won't be necessary," said Boudreaux. "You're already here, and the general will be coming through the door any second." The door at the back of the room opened silently, and General Dalton walked in. Clark started to react and call everyone to attention, but Dalton silenced him with a sharp look and a quick chop of his hand. "Were you rolling in the dirt like a dog?" asked Stratton, snidely. "No, I was leading my men," said Saunders. "You don't do that from an air-conditioned office." Clark started to jab Saunders in the ribs to give him a heads up, but it was too late. The general was standing there listening. "You disagree, Levi," she snapped. "I don't see why the general thinks so highly of you and Clark. You're just mavericks. Neither of you went to the academy. I graduated 3rd in my class at the Air Force Academy." "Well, whoop-de-fucking-do," said Saunders. "As I said, you don't lead from an office. I noticed you took one as soon as you could. Come to think of it, you never led a team. Some of us lead men into battle and some push paperwork. We both fucking know which one you are." "You're never going to get to full bird if I have anything to say about it," she snapped. "I prepare your fitness reports." "Is that a threat?" snapped Saunders, his anger rising. "Take it how you want it," she said. "Never play rock, paper, scissors with your career. Paper always wins." "I frankly don't give a fuck about," snarled Saunders, and Clark grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him back. Then it was Command Sergeant Major Hammond's turn to talk. "Listen, Lieutenant Colonel," said CSM Hammond. "I've served with some of the best the Army has to offer, and I'd follow Colonel Saunders to hell and back. And I don't say that lightly." Stratton's face turned red in anger, and she started to say something else when General Dalton interrupted. "I think that's quite enough," he said, stepping forward. There was iron in his tone and thunder in his words. Everyone froze and looked at the general, snapping to attention. "Lucian," said General Dalton, "do you feel the same as Lieutenant Colonel Stratton?" Boudreaux glanced at Stratton before speaking. "No, sir," said Boudreaux, "I do not." Dalton held Boudreaux fixed in his gaze, like he'd skewered a bug with a needle. After a moment, he turned and faced Stratton. He walked over and stood in front of her and then began rubbing his chin with his right hand, making certain she saw that he wore no academy ring. "I think we all know how you feel about men and women under your command," said Dalton. "General," she stammered, "I didn't mean—" "For me to hear you," finished Dalton. "Well, I did. Your smug attitude and dismissive tone toward these men bothers me. It bothers me a lot." Stratton started to say something, but Dalton cut her off with a glance. She swallowed hard and said nothing. "In case you haven't noticed, I don't wear an academy ring," said Dalton. "I'm a maverick, too. I joined as an enlisted man and was given a battlefield promotion when I was with Special Forces." Stratton's eyes grew wide. She could see her career dying before her eyes. "I've been in more combat than I care to mention," said Dalton. "Some of it in actual wars, but most of it in black bag operations that never formally existed. I've been shot 7 times and have plenty of scars and ribbons to prove that. But there's only one person in this room that I have to salute, and it is not you." Clark fidgeted and glanced at Saunders. Hammond said nothing but seemed amused at what was unfolding in front of him. "Now, I normally don't handle this kind of thing in front of my subordinates," said Dalton, "but since it didn't seem to bother you when you were berating the men who had obviously just returned from the field, I'll make an exception. Until I made general, I looked just like them, and when my men trained, I trained. That's how leaders do it. Leaders, Stratton, not managers, leaders. These men are leaders. Their troops follow them into death itself. You can't get that kind of loyalty behind a desk, and if you ever left yours, you might understand that." "But, sir," she pleaded, "I'm the team executive officer. I have a lot of paperwork to handle." "Yet you haven't gone out for PT with any of the teams once in the last 2 years," said Dalton. "Don't bother asking how I know that. I see more than I ever talk about, and I hear far more than you would believe. That's because I lead my people. I don't command them, I lead them. I go to PT with one of the teams at Lewis McChord once per week. That's 4 teams, so I go 4 days a week. Do I need to make that mandatory for all senior staff? I think I will." Dalton let his words hang in the air for a long moment, glancing around at each of them and locking eyes for a few seconds. "Clearly, you do not understand that concept," said Dalton. "I won't have that in my unit. You are dismissed. I want you cleared out of your office and on my plane within the hour. I'll personally take you to report to the Air Force Chief of Staff. We're all going to have a little chat about you. Dismissed." Stratton stood there like she'd been physically slapped in the face. All the color drained from her face and her eyes began turning red. "I said dismissed," snapped Dalton. Stratton turned and left the room. "My apologies, gentlemen," said Dalton, nodding at the others. "I simply can't abide that kind of behavior in an officer under my command. Now let's have a seat and I'll brief you on the situation." They all took seats at the conference table in silence, and once they were seated, Dalton leaned back and took a deep breath. "4 days ago," he began, "a television crew in Argentina embarked on an investigation searching for a lake monster that legend claims lives in Lake Nahualapi in Argentina. They call it Nahualito, and reports date back more than 200 years. They captured footage of something, but it wasn't the lake monster. They didn't know what it was, so they sent it to their lab, and when the lab went to follow up with them, they couldn't be reached. Another boat was sent to look for them. So far, they've found no sign of them." "They were on a boat?" asked Clark. "Yes, it's an 82-foot Burger flush-deck motor yacht, to be exact," said Dalton. "So it's unlikely that a boat that big went down without getting off a Mayday. Still, no one can find the boat or the crew." "Well, where do we come in?" asked Saunders. "I mean, this seems like a simple search and rescue so far." "It gets better," said Dalton. "Divers were sent from the Argentinian military to look for bodies or signs of wreckage, but the lake is over 1,500 feet deep in some places. Even on sonar, they found nothing. And then a team of Agrupación de Buzos Tácticos, or APBT, from the Tactical Divers Group of the Argentine Navy was sent in. Now, this is a highly trained Special Forces unit, and 10 of them went in the water, and they all vanished. One was able to get off a garbled call saying that they were under attack. Everyone exchanged glances. "Did the lake monster get them?" asked Hammond. "No," said Dalton. "The footage that the television crew sent to their lab before they vanished seems to indicate something else entirely." Dalton tossed a file in front of Saunders. He opened it and pulled out several 8x10 glossy photos. Laying them out on the table so they could all look at them, they all began looking intently at the images. "This looks almost like a man," said Saunders. "Almost," said Dalton. "Is it some kind of shark?" asked Clark. "Not with a tattoo on its arm," said Hammond, pointing at the picture. "Bingo," said Dalton. "Do any of you recognize that tattoo?" "Well, I've never seen it before," said Saunders, "but it looks military. But whose military?" "It's German," said Dalton. Or more to the point, it was German. It belonged to the Kampfschwimmergruppe of the Kriegsmarine, Nazi Marine Einsatzkommandos. "Nazis?" said Clark, frowning. "In a lake in Argentina?" "Gentlemen," said Dalton, "what I'm about to tell you is classified top secret. Our intelligence agencies don't think Hitler died in the Führer bunker in 1945. No one interrupted. "Instead, they think he was smuggled out of Germany using the rat lines," said Dalton. The rat lines were escape routes that were set up by friendly governments near the end of the war. It was codename Odessa, and there was another one called Die Spine, or Spider in German. They smuggled high-ranking Nazis out of Germany and spirited them away to places like Argentina, Brazil, and several other countries. It's believed that they killed one of Hitler's body doubles to throw everyone off. We know that an unknown number of high-ranking Nazi officials were smuggled into Argentina with the help of Juan Perón. The Israelis have captured a couple there in the 1970s. Everyone exchanged glances, and no one wanted to interrupt the general. "Now, we think that Hitler continued a lot of his activities from a protected compound on the lake," said Dalton, "in a place called the Analco House. Our best intel tells us he died in the 1960s, leaving behind Eva Braun with 2 daughters. Now, this is unconfirmed, but the sources are credible. Attempts to get agents close to that area to investigate have all failed." "All right," said Clark. "Let's say that's true. How does that apply to the thing in the water?" "Well, I'm getting to that," said Dalton. "Now, we suspect some of the genetic experiments performed by the Nazi scientists were continued in Argentina. We know for a fact that Joseph Mengele made it to Argentina. Our best guess is that they were attempting to create the perfect underwater soldier by splicing the genes of a shark with a human. They believe that thing in the image used to be a human, and we also suspect that there's more than one." "Well, that's not good news," said Clark. "No, it's not," said Dalton. "The Argentinian government has requested our assistance. They decided since it could possibly involve non-human creatures killing their citizens, then they would call in the experts on hunting things that aren't human." "All right," said Saunders. "When do we leave?" "We'll begin mobilizing the team immediately," said Dalton, "but I want to put some boots on the ground before that. Clark, pick a few of your people to go with you. The area is in Patagonia, so it's very remote. There are a few small towns there. It's considered the honeymoon destination of Argentina. So take a few of your people down there and act like tourists. Poke around and see what you can find out. And under no circumstances are you to engage hostiles. Wait for the rest of the team to arrive. It's going to take several days to get Team Odin to Argentina with enough equipment to operate. I want your team in the air within the hour. The Argentinian government will have someone to meet you when you land and take you to your destination." "All right, sir," said Clark. I'll make it a mixed group so we look like couples there on vacation." "That's a good call," said Dalton. "I'll leave who you take to your discretion. There will be a plane waiting for you at the airstrip. They already have their flight clearances and will be ready to depart as soon as you get there." "Yes, sir," said Clark, nodding at Saunders. "I'll go pick my team and get moving." Dalton and the others started discussing logistics and equipment as Clark exited the room. As he walked down the hallway, he could see Stratton clearing out her desk. He tried not to make eye contact, but she glared at him as he passed. Exiting the building, he began trotting toward the parade field where the team was going through hand-to-hand drills, and Gideon saw him coming and called for all exercise to stop. He could tell by the look on his face that something was going on. Nodding at Gideon, Clark addressed the entire team. "Folks, the balloon is going up," he said. "We're being activated for a mission. That's all I can tell you for now. All of Team Odin will be going, but I need the following personnel immediately. We're going to be the advanced CAT team. And if I call your name, fall out and come with me. Grey Eagle, Valkyrie, Runestone, Shield Maiden, and Raven." They all fell out and headed for Clark. "Murdoch," shouted Clark, "you've got Team 2 until we rendezvous on the site." "Got it, boss," said Murdoch. The group headed for the barracks, walking quickly. Once they were away from the team, Clark spoke up. "Shower and pack," he said. "Grab your full kit, but dress in civvies. We're wheels up within the hour." "What's the destination?" asked Grey Eagle. "I'll tell you everything once we're in the air," said Clark. "Congratulations, we're all couples now. Our cover is a group of couples on vacation. Grey Eagle, you and Shield Maiden are now together. Runestone, you and Raven are now a happy couple. And Valkyrie, you're stuck with me." "Hooah!" shouted Runestone with a wink at Raven. And Valkyrie smiled and said nothing. "Raven," said Clark, "my apologies, but you're going to have to leave Sage here. He'll have to stay in the kennel until this mission is over. Now, I know he doesn't work with anyone but you." "Yes, sir," said Raven. "If we need him for the team deployment, he can go with Caduceus. He helps me in the training sessions. He could bring him down with the team." "That's outstanding," said Clark. "Let's make that happen." "I'll send Caduceus a text once we're done here," she said, nodding. "All right, let's move, folks," said Clark. "The clock is running and Dalton wants us in the air ASAP." 30 minutes later, they all emerged from the armory carrying bags containing their gear. They had all freshly showered and were wearing civilian clothing. 2 Humvees were waiting to take them to the airstrip. "Let's roll," said Clark, climbing into the lead Humvee. Valkyrie and Grey Eagle climbed into the back of the same Humvee, while the other 3 climbed into the second. The Humvee drivers immediately fired up the engines and headed out of the parking lot. As they were going out toward the highway, Clark turned in his seat to talk to Grey Eagle and Valkyrie. "I don't want to tell you too much until we're in the air and I can brief everyone at the same time," he said. "But this one is insane. You're not going to believe it when I tell you." "Let me guess," said Valkyrie, grinning. "We're going to a remote desert island resort to bask in the sun for 2 weeks." "Not even close," said Clark, shaking his head. "Well, a girl can dream," she replied with a chuckle. "Unfortunately," said Clark, "we never get sent to nice vacation places. It's always the remote, rugged, and cold places. This place is cooler, but hopefully we won't see any extreme weather." "Well, that would be nice for once," said Valkyrie. "Maybe next time," said Clark. "I'll put in a request for a monster attack in Bora Bora or Bali." "Wow, a place I could wear a bikini instead of body armor," she mused. "Nah, that'll never happen." "Major," said the driver, "we're almost to the airstrip." "Thank you, Corporal," said Clark. As they pulled through the gate, they expected to see a military aircraft waiting for them on the tarmac, but instead there was a gleaming Gulfstream G650ER. The only indication that it wasn't a normal civilian aircraft was the fact that it was painted dark green and had Army insignias on the fuselage. The Humvee stopped less than 20 yards from the Gulfstream, and they all exited with their gear. A captain in Army Class B uniform with a name tag that read Cooper was waiting for them. He saluted Clark and handed him a thick manila envelope. "Thanks," said Clark. "What's in this?" "Travel orders," said Cooper, "plus authorization documents from SecDef giving you authority to operate internationally." Clark nodded and tucked the envelope under his arm. "That's not our usual transport," said Clark, pointing at the Gulf Stream. This is General Dalton's personal transport plane," explained Cooper. "He left a few minutes ago in a C-130 with Lieutenant Colonel Stratton. The General felt it would be good for her to experience how the troops travel. Besides, there's no jet better suited to get to your destination as quickly as this plane, short of a fighter jet." "All right," said Clark. "Let's get aboard and get in the air." "The pilot is ready to depart as soon as you give the word," said Cooper. "Good luck, Major." "Yeah," said Clark. "We might just need it." They exchanged salutes and everyone climbed aboard the jet. And once they stowed their gear, they all took a seat and got comfortable. "Major Clark," said the pilot, "I'm Captain Lincoln. I'm your pilot. Just let me know when you're ready." "We're good," said Clark. "Take off as soon as you're cleared." "All right," said Lincoln. "Please face your seats forward and buckle your seatbelts until we are at cruising altitude. We'll make a brief stop at Elgin Air Force Base in Florida for refueling and to pick up your cover documents and passports. Please send an email to General Dalton with your specifics." "Well, I'll send that now," said Clark, taking out his cell phone. "Outstanding," said Lincoln. "We'll be taxiing as soon as the tower gives us clearance." Clark sent the email while the others adjusted their seats and buckled in, and by the time they were finished, the plane was already taxiing toward the runway. Within minutes, they heard the whine increase as the engine spooled up, and then they began accelerating down the runway. And moments later, the landscape of Missouri was rapidly falling away from them as they climbed into the sky. Chapter 3. Fair Winds. 0100 hours, 14 May, Buenos Aires, Argentina. The Gulf Stream touched down on the military runway just outside of the main airport in Buenos Aires. Instead of stopping at the edge of the tarmac, they were directed to taxi directly to a hangar. Once they were inside, the big hangar doors rolled shut. "Someone's being very cautious," said Valkyrie, looking at the window. "Does this seem odd to anyone but me?" asked Grey Eagle. Clark opened one of the Pelican cases and tossed handguns to everyone. They all checked their Guncrafter Industries Glock 50 GI conversions, loading around into the chamber and clipping the holster onto their belts. "Something's very wrong here," said Clark, nodding at Grey Eagle. Everyone grabbed a position behind their seats and kept their weapons trained on the door. After a few minutes, the door was open from the outside. Clark glanced out the window and saw 3 men at the entrance of the aircraft, all carrying Brugger Tomet APC-9 submachine guns. "They're Argentinian Special Forces," said Clark. "Look at their guns." "There's 6 behind the vehicle," said Valkyrie. "We're trapped." "Fuck," hissed Clark. One of the 3 men at the door stepped up to the aircraft. He was wearing Argentinian combat fatigues with a perfectly formed dark green beret set at a jaunty angle. Clark tightened his grip on his pistol and brought it up behind the seat. "Major Clark," the man said in thickly accented English. Clark noticed that while he was carrying the BT APC-9, it was hanging from a single-point strap around his neck, and he did not have his hand on the weapon. Clark motioned for the others to stand down, and he put his pistol away as he stood. "I'm Clark," he said. "I apologize for the security measures," he said. "I understand why you would be apprehensive." "What's going on?" asked Clark. "Permit me to introduce myself," he replied. "I'm Captain Luis Vasquez, 601st Commando Company." "Captain," said Clark, nodding. "Please, if you will, come with me," said Vasquez, motioning off the aircraft. Clark hesitated for a moment before nodding at the others. They put away their weapons and then grabbed their bags and followed Vasquez off the plane. He led them to a large conference room at the far end of the hangar, and inside were platters of food and coolers filled with ice and drinks. Please have a seat and relax, said Vasquez. Welcome to Argentina. Why all the security? Asked Clark. There are certain factions that do not appreciate having American military here, he explained. But we were invited, said Clark. Of course, said Vasquez. My men and I are assigned to help you in any way that we can. We understand the delicate nature of your mission and the need for operational security, but you might not find everyone here will be so supportive. Well, why would we need a security detail? Asked Clark. No one is supposed to know we're here. All I can tell you is that there are factions within our government that are resistant to any outside militaries coming onto Argentine soil, said Vasquez. It is best if no one is aware of you being here until the rest of your unit arrives. Then it will be too late for them to do anything. Wait, said Clark. You said factions within your own government? Argentina is old, answered Vasquez. Many secrets and old alliances. I'm afraid I cannot tell you much. Certain things are just not spoken. I am a soldier and loyal to my country. I understand, said Clark. Perhaps we could arrange to have the team in your uniform so it would appear that you settled the problem on your own. Perhaps that might be possible, said Vasquez. It would certainly quiet some concerns. I knew some of the men who vanished. I know how good they were. They were some of the best we have, and when I saw the pictures that were captured by the television crew, I knew it was something outside our training. If we sent in more men, we would lose them. That's why I'm happy to have you here. So what do we do now? Asked Clark. How will we be able to function if we have to watch our backs from your government? Your cover is still in place, said Vasquez. If you will bring out your passports, we will stamp them so it appears that you entered the country correctly. Once that is done, you will appear to be normal tourists, at least until the rest of your team arrives. Everyone took out their passports, and one of Vasquez's men went around stamping them all. Now, are any of you a pilot? Asked Vasquez. Well, it depends on what needs to be flown, said Clark. I'm not certified on rotorcraft, but I can fly small planes. I have my license in the States. I can fly small planes as well, said Gray Eagle. Could you fly something like the planes flown during World War II? Asked Vasquez. I could, said Clark. Why? What do you have in mind? You are tourists, said Vasquez, smiling. You can take the plane to Nahuelhuapi without raising suspicion. Tourists charter flights there all the time. All right, said Clark. Take us to the plane. We'll do the rest. Just as long as you realize something, said Vasquez. Once you are at the lake, we cannot protect you. People there are quiet around strangers. Now be careful who you speak to and trust. I understand, said Clark. We only have to be on site for a few days before the rest of the team arrives. For your cover as tourists, said Vasquez, we have booked accommodations at the Corintoso Lake River Hotel in Villa La Angostura. Since you are supposed to be married couples, we booked 3 rooms. You check in as soon as you get there. All of this is courtesy of the Argentine government. We have, as you say, picked up the tub. It's the tab, said Clark. ¿Qué? Asked Vasquez. Picked up the tab, said Clark. Ah, gracias, said Vasquez. I do not quite fully understand American idioms and slang. He handed Clark a packet containing their check-in confirmation and flight plan. Thank you, said Clark, nodding. Very well, said Vasquez. We will take you to the plane. Good luck, and I hope you stop this creature before more lives are lost. Then get us to that plane, said Clark, nodding. If you will come with me, said Vasquez, turning and heading for a covered vehicle near the back door of the hangar. Clark took a moment to gather his gear and caught Gray Eagle's eye. He held back and started helping Clark with his bags. Something's going on here, whispered Clark. I want that plane checked out thoroughly before we lift off. Yes, sir, said Gray Eagle softly. I'll see if I smell any explosives and then check the engines. As they climbed back into the back of the vehicle, Vasquez closed the tarp so that no one could see who was in the back of the vehicle. Moments later, the engine started and they headed out of the hangar. Get your weapons ready, said Clark, leaning in so they could hear him without him speaking loudly. Everyone began unpacking their gear and quickly putting their kits together. Clark pulled out his AA-12 and loaded a magazine of flatchets. Everyone began unpacking their gear and quickly putting their kits together. Clark pulled out his AA-12 and loaded a magazine of flachettes, knowing that they would punch through most body armor. Valkyrie left her sniper rifle in its case and started loading her HK-UMP-50. Runestone, Shield Maiden, and Raven had the same weapon. Grey Eagle unpacked and assembled his Wilson Combat 458 SOCOM with the Tricon ACOG. "Get ready, folks," said Clark. "Something's wrong here and I don't trust these guys." Everyone nodded in agreement. "Be prepared for anything," said Grey Eagle. "When those flaps open, we might be looking down the barrels of rifles. Or they could be planning on our plane accidentally going down," added Clark. Grey Eagle took out his phone and began studying it. After a few minutes, he held up the screen to show Clark. It showed a subdued green-black military patch. "What's this?" asked Clark. "Unit insignia for the 601st Commando in the Argentine Army," said Grey Eagle. "That's not the same patch that Vasquez had on his shoulder," said Clark. "I know," said Grey Eagle. "It was this one." He swiped the screen, and another image appeared. "Yeah," said Clark. "That's the one he was wearing. What is it?" "It's Argentine military intelligence," said Grey Eagle. "He's not who he claims he is." "Well, shit," whispered Clark. They rode in silence for almost an hour when they felt the vehicle begin to slow. Grey Eagle and Clark made small slits in the canvas so they could peek out of the side of the vehicle. They were clearing a checkpoint and being waved through by military personnel. They had just entered a secure facility. Once clear, they accelerated back to highway speed. 10 minutes later, they took a left and began slowing down. They felt the driver downshift and knew they were soon going to come to a full stop. And peering through the slits, they saw that they were on an airstrip. "If they were just going to shoot us," whispered Valkyrie, "then I doubt they would have bothered to take us to an airstrip." "Then my money is on the plane being sabotaged," said Clark. "Notice they asked if we had a pilot. They didn't offer to fly us anywhere." The truck bounced to a stop and they heard excited voices speaking in Spanish. And Clark understood enough to overhear someone ask if the plane was prepared and ready to go. They received an affirmative answer, and then the voices approached the back of the vehicle. When it opened, there was a smaller contingent of security personnel. Captain Vasquez was there, and he motioned for them all to exit the vehicle. They climbed out and kept their weapons on their slings instead of packing them back into the bags. Clark wanted them to see that they were not going to be led like lambs to a slaughter. "There is your plane, Major," said Vasquez, pointing as he smiled. Clark turned and saw a surplus aircraft from World War II. "Holy shit," he said. "That's a Catalina PBY." "Yes, it is," said Vasquez, grinning. "It's a relic, no?" "It's an antique," said Clark. "It looks like it's in great shape, though." "This one belonged to a drug dealer," said Vasquez. "He's in prison and won't be needing it. We created documentation to put the plane in your name, Major Clark, and when this is over, you can keep it if you like." "I just might take you up on that," said Clark, grinning. "Your flight plan has already been placed with our civilian air traffic control," said Vasquez. "You left Florida yesterday and flew down the coast. Once you're in the air, fly out over the bay and stay below the radar. Military aircraft are already aware of this. You won't be challenged. Once you're safely out to sea, turn back toward the shore and climb high enough that you will be seen on radar. That should have plenty of fuel for the trip to Lago Nahualhuapi." "Well, that's a good plan," said Clark. Clark admired the plane for a few minutes before coming to his senses. "Let's get our gear stowed," he said, nodding at the others. While they were placing the gear inside, Grey Eagle walked around the aircraft, inspecting the fuselage, using his enhanced sense of smell. Then he climbed up onto the ladder and opened the engine cowlings, inspecting the fuel lines and linkage cables. Once he was sure that both engines were in good condition, he climbed down and headed inside. Clark stowed his gear and then headed for the cockpit to begin pre-flight. It was still dark, and if they could be in the air before the sun came up, then no one would be able to tell where the plane came from unless it was air traffic control at the airport. Once he was in the pilot's seat, he began checking his fuel gauges and other instruments, and after a few minutes, Gray Eagle climbed into the co-pilot's seat. "Did you find anything?" asked Clark, still checking instruments. "No," said Gray Eagle. "I didn't find any scent of explosives at all." "Did you visually check the fuel level?" asked Clark. "Yes, sir," said Gray Eagle. "Unless they filled it with water, we should be fine on fuel. And from what I remember, these things have about a 3,000-mile range. It's only about 1,000 miles to the lake." "Fantastic," said Clark. "Let's get this old girl in the air." Clark began the startup sequence while Gray Eagle cleared their flight with the tower. First, the starboard engine was brought online and allowed idle before the port engine was engaged. Soon both engines were roaring with power and idling smoothly. "I love this plane," said Clark, grinning. "Makes me feel like Jake Cutter in the Tales of the Gold Monkey. Only that plane was a Grumman seaplane." "Well, all you need now is a one-eyed dog," said Gray Eagle. "And one of those cool hats that Cutter wore," said Clark. "Hang on." Clark reached under his seat and searched for anything that might be down there. "Damn it," he muttered. "I guess that was too much to ask." "You honestly thought there would be one of those hats under your seat?" asked Gray Eagle. "No," said Clark, grinning. "Well, maybe." Gray Eagle shook his head. "But if I keep this plane, I'm buying one of those hats," said Clark, reaching for the controls. Giving power to the engines, they began taxiing out to the runway. And once they reached the end, Clark turned the aircraft around and set the brakes. They could feel the power of the engines rumbling through their seats. "You ready?" asked Clark. Gray Eagle nodded. Clark released the brakes and began increasing the throttle. The old aircraft streaked down the runway, gathering speed and generating lift. Clark could feel it getting lighter and began pulling back on the wheel and felt the nose come off the ground. Moments later, they were climbing into the sky. Clark was careful to stay below radar level, and he banked out toward the bay. The flight was smooth and steady without any signs of problems with the aircraft. Keeping the running lights off, he avoided the harbor lanes so he wouldn't fly directly over a freighter. "I'm going to put her down once we're away from town," said Clark. "Why?" asked Valkyrie, poking her head into the cockpit. "I have a bad feeling that there's a surprise waiting for us outside the harbor," explained Clark. "Maybe a missile frigate or something." "You don't trust these guys, do you?" she asked. "I have this nagging feeling that something is wrong," said Clark. "They were awfully glib about telling us there are factions of their government that don't want us here. And then there's the fact that unless he was part of the mission briefing, there's no need for the security team that met us to know the full nature of our mission. That's just bad OPSEC. Also, they gave us a plane that was confiscated from a drug dealer. A plane, I might add, that's close to 80 years old. Planes this old go down all the time and no one bats an eye." "Trust your instincts, sir," said Gray Eagle. "I found that you are rarely wrong when you're in the field." "All right," said Valkyrie. "What do you want us to do?" "Once we're on the deck," said Clark, "I want to recheck everything. We're missing something, I'm sure of it. Either a bomb, a tracker, or sabotage. We're missing something, I just know it." "If it's there," said Valkyrie, "we'll find it." The false light of dawn was starting to color the eastern horizon, turning the water to an odd mixture of gold and purple. They were away from any occupied part of the harbor, so Clark began to cut power and angled for a landing on calm water. "Everyone grab a chair," said Clark. "We're landing." 2 minutes later, they were gliding through the water as Clark angled them in near a long wooden dock that came out from a dark section of the shore. "This looks abandoned," said Clark. "We'll pull up to the dock and give this thing a proper going over." Cutting the power, they drifted the last few feet toward the dock. Gray Eagle went out through the hatch above the cockpit of the aircraft and leaped over to the dock, taking the anchor line with him. He took it off quickly and reached for the pouch on his belt and grabbed the small flashlight. He clicked it on and climbed onto the roof of the plane and then up onto the wings. and from there it was just a matter of opening the engine cowlings. The engines were pinging hot, and he could smell the oil and metal scent. Careful not to touch the hot metal, he began shining the light around the interior of the cowling. He found nothing, and he decided to try one more area. He laid on his back and slid to the edge of the cowling and opened the bottom panel. And he shined the light inside, and he saw something out of place. There was a dim red light attached to a block of Semtex with an electronic detonator. "Looks like he was right," whispered Grey Eagle. Activating his comm, he whispered, "Fenrir to Thunder God," he said. "We have confirmation. Over." "Copy. On my way," said Clark. Clark climbed up onto the wing and headed for Grey Eagle. Leaning down from the opposite side of the big engine, Clark popped off the cowling and looked where Grey Eagle was shining the light. "Damn it," he hissed. "I fucking knew it. Can you disarm it?" "I think so," said Grey Eagle, "just so long as they don't hit the detonator while I'm working on it." "Do you think there's one on the other engine?" asked Clark. "I think it's safe to assume," said Grey Eagle. "The charge is big enough to shear off the wing, rupturing the fuel tanks in the process. We'd have been scattered all over the South Atlantic." "Go ahead and disarm them," said Clark. "We're going to finish searching the rest of the plane for plans B, C, and D just in case." "That's a good call, sir," said Grey Eagle. "I should have these taken care of in a few minutes. What do you want me to do with the Semtex when I'm done?" "Hang on to it," said Clark. "We might need it to return the favor before this is over. Let me know when you're done. I'm going to have the others keep searching while I call All-Father with an update. Good thing I brought my sat phone." While the others searched the aircraft from top to bottom, Clark climbed onto the deck and walked a short distance away. Activating the sat phone, he punched in a code and hit send. The encryption protocols engaged, and he waited while a secure link was established. After a series of clicks, it began ringing. "Go for All-Father," said the voice of Saunders. "All-Father, this is Thunder God," said Clark. "We have a situation, and we're not even on site yet." "What's going on?" asked Saunders. "We were met at the airport by Captain Vasquez and a security team of Argentine military intelligence," said Clark. "We were taken to a plane that we were to fly ourselves to the lake." "That wasn't what we agreed on with the Argentine government," said Saunders. "Your contact was supposed to be Major Alfonso Guerrera of the 601st Commando Company. They were going to take you to the lake by helicopter." "We were asked if we had a pilot," said Clark. "Both Grey Eagle and I are rated on prop planes, so we said yeah. They gave us an old Catalina PBY and told us to follow a specific flight plan that would take us out over the ocean before popping up on radar. I had a bad feeling, so I put it down in the bay so we could check the plane. So far, we found 2 bombs planted on both engines." "And they just claim you went down in an old plane," said Saunders. "Exactly," said Clark. "I have the feeling that they want us to appear on radar and to contact Argentine air traffic control to establish who we were and where we came from. Once we did that, I think they were going to detonate the engines and just send us into the ocean." "I don't know who you made contact with," said Saunders, "but I just got off the phone with our contact down there and they said they never contacted you." "As soon as we landed," said Clark, "we were directed to taxi into a hangar and they shut it down. With the security team, we were expecting them to just open fire on us. They might have had they not found us armed. I don't think they would have been able to hide a firefight." "If the real Argentine military were nearby," said Saunders, "then it would have attracted a lot of attention." "Well, that's the thing, sir," said Clark. "I think they were military. The base they took us to was a military facility." "Then there are factions moving against each other," said Saunders. "Well, do we scrub the mission?" asked Clark. "I can exfil immediately. We've already got possession of an aircraft. Did they let the general's plane leave?" "Affirm," said Saunders. "They refueled and left Buenos Aires within 20 minutes of landing. That's confirmed. I'll brief Colonel Boudreaux and we'll contact Asgard. It's his call if we Charlie Mike or pull the plug. I'll contact you back within the hour. Stay put until I called." "Copy that," said Clark. "Out." Breaking the link, Clark put the sat phone in standby mode so it would alert them when contact was resumed. Heading back to the plane, he put the phone into a pouch on his hip, and Grey Eagle was just climbing down from the top of the wings. "What's a good word?" asked Clark. Grey Eagle tossed him 2 one-pound blocks of Semtex. "They use Semtex instead of C4, said Grey Eagle. "That's why I didn't smell it. They wanted it to go unnoticed in an inspection. Semtex is completely odorless. There's enough there to turn the entire plane into chaff. They didn't want anything recovered." 2 pounds of Semtex, said Clark, glancing at the blocks. "That's enough to make a hell of a boom. They weren't taking any chances." "Well, what did Allfather say?" asked Grey Eagle. "We're on standby for the moment," said Clark. "He's briefing Asgard. Honestly, as much as I was intrigued by those pictures, I think we should scrub the mission. We already had one faction try to kill us. What the hell's going on down here anyway?" "Nazis," said Grey Eagle. "What do you mean?" asked Clark. "If the image we saw is linked to the Nazis," said Grey Eagle, "and there are enough high-ranking Nazis that fled Germany and made their way here, then it would be reasonable to assume that they used their gold to gain political power and influence." "So you think that in addition to the creature in the picture," said Clark, "that we might encounter actual Nazis?" "Descendants for sure," said Grey Eagle. "It is possible that some of the actual expatriates could still be alive." "If that thing in the water was once a person," said Clark, "then God knows what kind of other experiments they've been performing." "That's reasonable to assume as well," said Grey Eagle. "They performed all sorts of inhuman experiments in prisoners and even their own people. It isn't outside the realm of belief to think that they could have extended their lifespans." "And that means," said Clark, his eyes going wide, "that Hitler himself could theoretically still be alive," said Grey Eagle. "We have no proof of that," said Clark. "That's a big leap." "But not an impossible one," said Grey Eagle. "If they perfected any sort of genetic manipulation that could extend life, then he would be their number one priority." "Well, that changes this entire mission profile," said Clark. "We're not here to hunt them. I want to, don't get me wrong, but that's not our mission." "But that is exactly where the mission might lead us," said Grey Eagle. "If they're behind it, do we just stop the entire problem, or just the thing in the water?" "You pose an excellent question," said Clark, "but I think the answer to that is way above both of your pay grades." Grey Eagle nodded in agreement. "Hey, boss," said Valkyrie, climbing up out of the hatch above the cockpit of the plane. "We're all clear in here. No explosives, but we did find a tracker stuck under the instrument panel. You want me to kill it?" "In for a penny, in for a pound," whispered Clark, turning to face her. He smiled and waved. "Kill it," he said. "By now they already know we didn't follow their flight instructions." "They might not take too kindly to that," she replied. "Honestly," said Clark, "I'm counting on it." The sat phone on his hip buzzed and he took it out. He'd received a text message. 2 words filled the screen, and they caused Clark to smile. Charlie, Mike. Chapter 4, Nawalapi. 0700 hours, 14 May, Lake Nawalapi, Argentina. Clark banked the plane to starboard and leveled out. On the horizon, they could just make out the end of the lake. They could see a small city ahead, but beneath them were miles and miles of trees and mountains. "There it is, folks," he said, smiling. "Lago Nawalapi. The town we're about to pass over is San Carlos de Bariloche." "Are we landing soon?" asked Valkyrie. "Not just yet," said Clark. "We're going to the far end of the lake. Our destination is Villa La Angostura. We'll land in the lake there." "How soon?" she asked, leaning up to get a better look through the windshield. "Maybe 20 minutes," said Clark. "I'm going to drop down to 100 feet off the deck and slow down. Let's all get a good look around and see if we can see anything." "I'll see what I can spot," she said, ducking back into the passenger compartment. "Do you think we'll see anything from the air?" asked Grey Eagle. "Maybe," said Clark. "Maybe not. It's worth checking. You never know when something might get caught off guard." I could imagine it's not every day that a seaplane flies over this lake, said Grey Eagle. You do see the irony in this, right, sir? You mean that we're here looking for a monster that could have Nazi ties, said Clark, while flying in an airplane from World War II? I suppose we could be in a P-51 Mustang instead, said Grey Eagle. Nah, we wouldn't all fit, said Clark, but I don't see any place to land a B-17 around here, so the seaplane was probably our best choice, although I'd give a month's pay just to fly one of those P-51s. But still, said Grey Eagle, if there were any Nazis or their supporters, I don't think the irony would be lost on them. I hadn't considered that until you mentioned it, said Clark. Oh well, we might as well flaunt it. Nothing we can do about it now. This might make us something of a target, said Grey Eagle. Well, I think that target has been on us since we landed in Buenos Aires, said Clark. Fair enough, said Grey Eagle. You want to take the stick for this landing? Asked Clark. Sure, said Grey Eagle. Thank you, sir. Grey Eagle gripped the controls and Clark released, bringing his hands into the air near his head. Adjusting his altitude, Grey Eagle leveled off at 100 feet above the ground and banked out toward the middle of the lake. Nahualapi was over 50 miles long and more than 6 miles wide at its widest point. Before you land, said Clark, take us north of the town. I want to circle over the house they call Analco. I just want to get a peek from the air. I have a feeling it's the closest we're going to get to that house. Yes, sir, said Grey Eagle. Clark got out his binoculars and began glassing the horizon. He was searching the area of water near Analco. Took him a moment to locate it. They were getting close to that end of the lake, and soon they would be able to see with the naked eye. There was a flurry of activity around the house. He continued to watch until they were close enough that he no longer needed the binoculars. The house appeared to be built in the old Bavarian style and looked nothing like the houses in the small towns they'd flown over. This looked like it would have been more at home in the Bavarian Alps than in the mountains of Argentina. And furthermore, it was far more than just a large manor house. There was an entire complex there, all built in the same style, and he could see fields where food was grown and a small herd of cattle. Clark watched as they seemed to be taking several people into the house under guard, ushering them from 2 black SUVs. None of them appeared to be in restraints, and the guards were more concerned with watching the surroundings than restraining the people. This was a security detail. He only got a brief glimpse of the people they were escorting. It appeared to be 3 couples and 1 man with a briefcase. They were all dressed well, and the security detail was all wearing clothing that, while it wasn't a uniform, certainly was worn like one. Khaki pants over tactical boots with a khaki shirt. The pants and shirt were both pressed, and they all had black leather pistol belts with ammo pouches and a pistol in a holster. In their hands were HK-G36 assault rifles. Looking around the house, he saw the man standing on the small balcony at one end of the house. He appeared to be in his late 60s with iron gray hair that was kept military short and combed straight back. He leaned against the railing and took a deep breath of the mountain air. With a smile, he exhaled. Moments later, another man emerged from the house behind him, and Clark could see him speaking to the older man, who slowly turned to face the newcomer. The older man clasped his hands behind his back as he began walking toward the house, and as the older man passed the other man, Clark could see that he was much shorter than the younger man. "No way," whispered Clark. "Sir," said Grey Eagle. "It can't be," said Clark. "What can't be, sir?" "I just saw a guy that fits the physical description of Adolf Hitler," said Clark, "only he looks like he's in his 60s. Hitler would be well over 100 by now. He didn't have the mustache, though." "Unless they found a way to slow the aging process," said Grey Eagle. "Besides, the mustache would be one of the first things I'd get rid of if I was trying to blend in." "It just can't be him," said Clark. "It can't be." "Can we afford to assume it isn't?" asked Grey Eagle. "No," replied Clark hesitantly. "We can't." A few moments later, they came in low and slow over the Analco house and then banked wide to the south. Clark could see two men standing in the front of the house watching the aircraft as it passed over. They were close enough to see that both men were physically fit with blonde hair. They wore their khakis pressed, the same as the security detail had, and they both had the pistol belt but no rifle. Gray Eagle brought the plane around and lined up for a landing in the lake near the small village of Villa La Angostura. Beginning his descent, he brought the plane down smoothly and easily, avoiding the fishing boats that were on the lake. Once down, he guided the plane along the route shown by the GPS unit on his phone. Moments later, he cut the power and coasted up to the dock that belonged to the Corintoso Lake and River Hotel. As he was shutting down the engines, Clark climbed through the cockpit hatch and jumped across the dock. Taking the mooring lines, he tied up the aircraft to prevent it from drifting away from shore. And while he was tying off the lines, two people came walking quickly toward him from the hotel. "Senor Clark," said one of the men, "I am Hector, the house manager. Welcome to the Corintoso. We've been expecting you, and it is not every day that we have guests arrive by seaplane, especially one as beautiful as yours." "Well, thank you," said Clark, pulling the lines tight. "I'm Daniel Clark, and thank you for meeting us here." "Everything is prepared for your stay," said Hector. "Do you need any assistance with your baggage?" "I think we can get it," said Clark. "Do you have our keys, or do I need to come to the front desk to check in?" "There will be no need for that," said Hector, handing Clark several keys that were marked with their room numbers. "Since you already paid in advance, we took the liberty of signing you in. Your rooms are all on the top floor for the best possible view of the lake and the mountains. Is this your first visit here?" "Yes," said Clark. "We wanted someplace unique." "For your honeymoon?" asked Hector. "I was told you were celebrating your honeymoon and your friends came with you." "Yes," said Clark. "They should be out in a moment." The door to the plane opened and Gray Eagle came out first. Clark was relieved that they had all concealed their weapons inside suitcases. Valkyrie stepped out and walked over to Clark. She slipped her arm through his. "This is my wife," said Clark, grinning. "This is Miranda. Miranda, this is Hector." "Nice to meet you," said Valkyrie, grinning. "You are a very lucky man, senor," said Hector. "Your wife is very beautiful." "Well, thank you," she said, leaning her head on Clark's shoulder. Clark smiled but said nothing, and he reached for his wallet. He took out a 20 and gave it to Hector. "I think we can take it from here," said Clark. "Thank you for all your help." "The Corintoso Restaurante is open until midnight," said Hector, "but room service is available all night. The bar is open until 3 in the morning. Of course, for such honored guests, we can make exceptions in the hours and the menu, should you require it." "Can we rent a car to go sightseeing?" asked Valkyrie. "Of course," said Hector, smiling. "Just call the front desk and we will arrange it and bill it to your room." "Thank you," she said. Hector smiled and gave them a short bow. "I hope you enjoy your stay," he said, and then turned on his heel and headed back up the dock. Once they were out of earshot, Clark glanced at Valkyrie with a wry smile. "Sorry, boss," she said, grinning. "Just selling the cover story." "No, that's not it," he said with a chuckle. "I almost introduced you as Valkyrie. Took me a moment to remember your first name." "Well, let's hope Amanda doesn't get mad at me for playing your wife," said Valkyrie, grinning. "Well, as long as we don't consummate the marriage," said Clark, "I think she'll be fine." "I don't know," mused Valkyrie. "No guy I ever dated flew me away in his private plane to a beautiful faraway country to stay in a gorgeous hotel on the shores of a lake with a view like this. If this wasn't a mission, it would be the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me." Clark shook his head and shouldered his bag. Glancing over at Gray Eagle, he shrugged and gave him a slight smile. Gray Eagle returned the shrug and picked up his bags. "I wonder if they have a pool," said Valkyrie as she headed up the dock toward the hotel. "Hey, I'm not married," said Runestone, grinning and looping his arm through Raven's as he carried both of their bags. "Best of luck to you both, though." They all headed inside and up to their rooms, and although they were all on the same floor, none of the rooms were adjoining. Clark unlocked his room and opened the door. It was a large suite with a hot tub in the room. Through the large windows was a magnificent view of the snow-capped Andes Mountains and a wide expanse of the lake, and Valkyrie walked over and flung open the windows, allowing the cool mountain air to flood the room. "Wow," she said, "this view is amazing." Clark looked around the room. There was only one bed, but there was a small sitting area with a couch. He mentally decided that he'd take it and let Valkyrie have the bed, and then there was no chance of unintended contact or temptation. "I'll take the couch," he muttered. "Well, suit yourself," she said, flinging herself on the large king-sized bed. "Oh my God, this bed is amazingly soft. Can I just stay here for the rest of our stay?" Clark chuckled as he put the bags down beside the large bureau. All the furniture looked to be handmade, probably by local artisans. The woodwork was beautiful. "Hell," Clark said, "I wonder if I could buy a set of this furniture and have it shipped back to the States." "Well, ask Hector," said Valkyrie, chuckling. "He'll probably have a set charged to the room and loaded into the plane." Clark just grinned. Looking around the room, he noticed that there wasn't a phone or a television. "Huh?" he said. "No TV and no phone? I wonder why." "Because this is the honeymoon suite," said Valkyrie, grinning. "There are chocolates and champagne on the table by the window. They aren't expecting us to spend much time watching television." "Oh," said Clark, "that makes sense." Valkyrie reclined back on the bed and kicked off her shoes. Clark smiled at her and opened his mouth to say something when his phone vibrated. He took it out, and he had a text from Grey Eagle. He unlocked his phone and read the text. "Be careful what you say," it read. "Our room is bugged." "Shit," mouthed Clark, turning the screen and showing it to Valkyrie. She read the message and her eyes opened wide. "Should I remove them?" asked Grey Eagle. Clark thought about it for a moment before texting back. "Not yet," he sent. "For now, leave them in place and just watch what you say. Warn Runestone and Raven." "Copy that," was the reply. Turning to Valkyrie, Clark slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Why don't we get everyone else and go and have an early lunch?" he said. "I'm starving. Then maybe we can get a car and go sightseeing." "Oh, I could eat," she said, reluctantly getting out of the bed and slipping her shoes back on. "And I'd love to look around this town." Clark took out his pistol and slipped it into his jeans with an inside waistband holster, and then slipped 3 extra magazines into his jacket pocket. "Ready when you are, my dear," he said with a wink. Clark put the bags into the bureau and put a zip tie around the handle. Then he'd know if anyone tampered with it. As they headed out the door, Valkyrie slipped her fingers through Clark's and held his hand. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" whispered Clark. "A little bit," she whispered back. Clark shook his head and knocked on Grey Eagle's door. Grey Eagle opened the door, and Clark could tell from his posture that he had a gun behind the door. "Let's see if we can get an early lunch," said Clark, "and then maybe do a little recon." "That's a good idea, sir," said Grey Eagle. "All right, knock off the sir shit until we're back with the team," said Clark softly. "It might blow our cover." Grey Eagle nodded, and after a moment he opened the door all the way, and Clark could see he was adjusting his pistol in the small of his back. Shield Maiden walked out of the room with a smile on her face. "Did you see the view?" she asked, smiling broadly. "Yes," replied Valkyrie. "This place is amazing." Clark knocked on Runestone's door and heard an excited voice. "Just a minute." Clark glanced at Grey Eagle and reached for his pistol. Moments later, Runestone opened the door and leaned out from behind it. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Yeah," he said. "What's up, sir?" "Are we interrupting something?" asked Clark, raising one eyebrow. "Well, she opened the curtains and fell in love with the view," he said, grinning. "And when I told her that it was Lago Nahualapi and the Andes Mountains, well, one thing kind of led to another. It is a romantic view. What can I say?" "He said it in Spanish," said Raven from across the room. "We're going down to the restaurant to get some lunch," said Clark, grinning. "Come join us when you're done." "Aye, sir," said Runestone. "What can I say, sir? It's the Latin air in my Latin charm. She couldn't resist. We'll be down in about a half an hour." "Or maybe an hour," corrected Raven. We'll wait for you in the restaurant, said Clark, chuckling as they headed down the hallway. Well, it is a great view, said Shield Maiden. And he does have a hot accent, said Valkyrie. Alvarez is from San Diego, said Clark, chuckling, not Argentina. Well, I don't think it matters, said Grey Eagle, shaking his head. How did you locate the bugs? Asked Clark. It's the scent, said Grey Eagle. They're easy to find. Most electronics have a very distinctive smell. All right, said Clark. Anytime you locate more, would you let me know? No problem, said Grey Eagle. If you find any in public areas, either point them out or just eliminate them, said Clark. Got it, said Grey Eagle. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator, they arrived in the lobby. The ground expanse of the foyer was accentuated by all the hand-carved woodwork of the trimmed desk and furniture. A chandelier made of antlers hung above the center of the room and gave the place a feeling of a rustic lodge. A warm fire was crackling in the large stone fireplace that was the centerpiece of the room. The concierge behind the desk saw them and smiled broadly. It wasn't Hector, but he acted like he knew who they were. Coming around the desk, he opened his arms like he was about to embrace them all in one large hug. Welcome to the Corontoso Lake and River Hotel, Senor y Senora Clark, he said excitedly. I am the concierge, Ernesto. We are happy to have you and your party here. How can I make your stay an experience you will never forget? Well, Clark said, we're going to grab some lunch, but we'd like to rent a car afterward. Can we get one that all 6 of us can fit in? Of course, senor, said Ernesto. It will be ready by the time you are finished dining in our fine restaurante. Although it is early for lunch, we can accommodate you. Today's special is freshly caught paco a las brasas, grilled to perfection and served with sliced tomatoes, potatoes, and fried onion rings. What is paco a las brasas? Asked Valkyrie. It's a fish related to the piranha, said Clark. It's grilled on a wood fire and it's really good. Have you been here before, senor? Asked Ernesto. You certainly know your Argentinian cuisine. I've never been to this lake before, said Clark, but I spent a few weeks in Buenos Aires a few years back. Ah, said Ernesto, smiling. Then you have not had it properly prepared. For the best chef in all of Argentina works here. You will think your taste buds have died and gone to heaven. I'm sold, said Clark. I'm having the special. Gracias, Ernesto. Has sido mucha ayuda. Ernesto nodded and bowed slightly and then returned to his desk. I didn't know you spoke Spanish, said Valkyrie. Is that the only language you speak? I speak Spanish, German, Pashto, and Italian, said Clark, and a little Hungarian. How did you learn so many languages? She asked. I learned language easily for some reason, said Clark. I learned Spanish as a kid because my best friend Ricardo was from Mexico. I picked up German from my grandfather, and Pashto I had picked up in Afghanistan, and Italian because I had the hots for an Italian girl when I was in the army. I learned to speak it so I could ask her out, and she wasn't interested. You learned a language for her, and she said no? Asked Shield Maiden. I would have gone out with you just for speaking Italian. Italian is such a beautiful language. Yeah, but they also have the best cuss words, said Clark, grinning. What about you, Grey Eagle? Asked Shield Maiden. How many languages do you speak? Grey Eagle drew in a breath and let it out slowly. I speak Lakota, he said. Cherokee, Cheyenne, Apache, and I can carry on a conversation in French. I'm not fluent, though. I know enough Spanish to order a beer and tacos. They all headed into the restaurant and were seated by the pretty young hostess. They were given a large table with a view of the lake once Clark explained that they had 2 more guests coming to join them shortly. Oh my God, I could retire in this place, said Valkyrie, looking around. This place is gorgeous. Don't get too caught up in this place, said Clark. If this place is a hotbed for German expats, then we might not want to come back, especially once they realize we're not here on vacation. Good point, said Valkyrie, but I can enjoy it while it lasts. That you can, agreed Clark. The waiter breezed to the table and set menus along with the glasses of water in front of each of them. We have 2 more joining us shortly, said Clark. Of course, senor, said the waiter. My name is Christian. Can I get you all something to keep you until the rest of your party arrives? Last time I was in Argentina, said Clark, there was a beer I was quite fond of. Do you carry Ortomundo? Si, senor, said Christian. It is one of my personal favorites. Clark glanced around and they all nodded. We'll take 4 of those, said Clark. We'll order when the others get here. Of course, senor, said Christian, gliding away toward the kitchen. Moments later, he returned with 4 large mugs of dark red beer. As he sat them on the table, another server placed 2 large baskets of fresh chips and 4 bowls of salsa. Enjoy, said Christian. If you need anything, I will be close by. Grey Eagle picked up his beer and took a long pull. This is good, he said. He was surprised. It's also like 7.5% alcohol, cautioned Clark, so go easy. 3 beers and 4 baskets of chips later, Runestone and Raven joined them. Her face was flushed and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail when it had been down before. Nice of you 2 to finally make it, said Valkyrie with a sly grin. Grey Eagle was completely unaffected by the alcohol, but he could tell the others were beginning to show signs. Clark had deliberately started drinking less and eating more chips after the second beer. Valkyrie and Shield Maiden both seemed to be a bit more tipsy, and Runestone pulled out Raven's chair for her before taking his seat. Well, I didn't want to rush things, said Runestone with a wink. The waiter whisked up to the table and placed menus, another round of beer and more chips on the table. When you are ready to order, he said, backing away from the table. Just wave to me. An hour later, they all emerged from the restaurant and headed for the front desk. Ernesto handed Clark a set of keys for a vehicle and motioned at the front door. It is a green SUV parked just outside, said Ernesto. Gracias, said Clark. They headed outside and Clark tossed the keys to Grey Eagle. I think you'd better drive, he said. Grey Eagle caught the keys and headed for the driver's side, and Valkyrie slid into the passenger side, scooting over to the middle of the bench seat. Clark took the passenger side, and the others climbed into the back with Runestone in the middle. He was smiling like a schoolboy. I like this arrangement, he said, glancing in both directions. Well, don't get too comfortable, said Shield Maiden, grinning. I'm supposed to be married to Grey Eagle, remember? My pretend husband might get pretend jealous. Well, that drew chuckles from everyone but Grey Eagle, who just shook his head. Take us down to the village, said Clark. I want to get a look around a bit, and then we'll follow the road down past Inalco. I'd like to see how close we can get to it without getting chased off by security. Chapter 5. Recon. 1000 hours, 14 May, Lake Nahualapi, Argentina. The little village looked like it was taken straight from a storybook. There were open-air markets and vendors selling everything from clothing to fresh fruit to freshly caught fish to sunglasses. Clark felt a pang of remorse at not being able to stop. He also noticed all 3 women were looking back with wistful smiles on their faces. If they're still open when we finish our recon, said Clark, we can stop and check it out. That seemed to cheer them up as they headed on through town. There were several restaurants and bars along with craftsmen advertising handcrafted furniture, leather works, and custom-tailored clothing. Hell, no wonder they snuck out of Germany to come here, said Runestone. This place is almost paradise. I don't see a single Starbucks coffee place, said Raven, looking around. I stand corrected, said Runestone. Now it's paradise. If it were paradise, said Valkyrie, it would be a beach warm enough where I could wear a bikini, or better yet, no bikini. Can I change my vote, said Runestone, grinning. Raven elbowed him in the ribs, and he grunted in mock pain. I was just kidding, he said. Now you're taking this fake marriage stuff seriously? You weren't complaining a couple of hours ago, she retorted. Ouch, said Clark. She's got you there. As they left the small village and returned to the highway, they followed the shore of Nahualapi out of town. Soon the trees on both sides of the road were thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the edge of the road. Along the left side, just at the edge of the trees, was a tall barbed wire fence with signs approximately every 30 feet, and they read, "No trespassing. Violators will be shot," in bold letters in English, Spanish, and German. As they were driving, Gray Eagle slowed and pointed to the left. "If my mental map is correct," he said, "the Analco house should be straight through the woods in that direction." "Well, I can't see a thing," said Valkyrie. "The woods are too thick." "Well, I think that's the idea," said Clark. "Keep driving. I don't want to get them too suspicious." Through gaps in the trees, they could see a trail just inside the tree line that followed the edge of the property. If they hadn't been watching, they would have missed a green Jeep that drove down the trail in the opposite direction. "I bet that trail runs around the entire property," said Clark. "They can drive the entire perimeter." Gray Eagle continued driving, and a few hundred yards later they saw a driveway turning to the left onto the property. Just inside the trees was a gate blocking the driveway with 6 armed guards at it. They were all dressed like the others, in khaki shirts and pants and tactical boots. They were also all carrying HK G36 assault rifles. There were 4 more of those green Jeeps parked behind the gate, and they could see where the trail crossed the driveway behind them. Gray Eagle kept his eyes straight ahead so the guards wouldn't think they were checking the place out. The others in the back seat were staring openly, but they were behind tinted glass. The guards watched them pass by with bored detachment, but Gray Eagle saw one of them make a note of the license plate. "They're taking down our plate number," said Gray Eagle. "I also spotted cameras in the trees above the gate," said Runestone. "I saw cameras," said Clark. "Whatever else is going on, the guards are well trained." "Where to?" said Gray Eagle. "Just keep going," said Clark. "I studied the map. Take the first left and look for a sign for Balneario Diurno Lago Espejo. There's a beach there. We can stop for a while. I want to make sure they don't see us return for a while. They're already suspicious of us." A few minutes later, the road forked and Gray Eagle took the left. It wasn't long before they saw the signs. Pulling off the road and onto the driveway, they found an area of beach that looked almost like something out of a tropical vacation poster. It was complete with a wooden pier that stretched out into the water. Only the trees were coniferous instead of palm trees, and they could see the mountains in the distance. "Here's your beach, ladies," said Clark. "You can enjoy yourselves for a little while. I want to wait at least an hour until we drive back past the gate." As they climbed out of the SUV, they saw a small shop that sold swimsuits and equipment. Valkyrie glanced at Clark, and he took out his wallet. Handing her his credit card, she grinned mischievously. "Go grab yourself some suits and enjoy the beach for a bit," he said, chuckling. Valkyrie, Raven, and Shield Maiden all headed inside the shop. "You're going to be broke," said Gray Eagle. "I get reimbursed by the Army for expenses in the field," said Clark, grinning. "Sure," said Gray Eagle, "but will your wife wonder why you bought 3 bikinis and swimming gear during a mission?" "Yeah, you might have a point there," said Clark, the smile vanishing. "I'll have to explain that, I'm sure." A few minutes later, the women emerged carrying beach bags with their clothes in them, and they were all wearing very skimpy bikinis and carrying beach towels. "It's a little cooler than I prefer," said Valkyrie, handing Clark his credit card. "But I'm going to take the win. It's just shy of 80 degrees according to my phone." "That's good enough. Let's get some sun, girls." "We'll meet you down there," said Clark, heading for the food vendor shack. "Are you hungry already?" asked Gray Eagle. "We just ate." "No," said Clark. "I'm grabbing some beers to take down by the water. I want to drink while we discuss our options." Clark emerged from the shop a few minutes later carrying a styrofoam cooler full of ice and beer. "They didn't have Ortomundo," said Clark. "I got Patagonia wheat. I knew you liked that American wheat beer. This should be good." "Yes, sir," said Gray Eagle. "Boulevard wheat." "Well, this is as close as you're going to get down here," said Clark. "Now let's go sit with the girls and discuss our strategy. And for God's sake, try to look like a tourist, Gray Eagle." Once they were all together and sitting in the sand, Clark made sure that no one else was within hearing range before handing out the beers. Picking up a stick, he began sketching in the sand. "All right," said Clark. "This is crude, but it'll have to do." He began sketching a map of the area that they just passed through. "The lake is here," he added, drawing another line. "That means that all of this land, from the edge of the town to the motocross place we passed, belongs to the owner of Inalco. We've seen the security. The question is, do they patrol inside the perimeter?" "I would," said Gray Eagle, cracking open his first beer. "Random patrols with roving teams." "As would I," agreed Clark. "From the look of the guards I've seen, they look like pros. I think we can safely assume they patrol the interior." Valkyrie rolled over onto her stomach and lowered her sunglasses so she could look at the map without leaving her beach towel. "These woods are so thick," she said. "There's not a single place I could set up and get a line of fire on the house. The only place I can think of where I could is from the lake. That poses an entirely different set of problems." "I'm not looking to have to engage a target," said Clark. "I just want eyes on it. I want to know what's going on in there." "What about the creatures in the lake?" asked Runestone. "Well, my gut tells me they're connected to whatever it was I saw on that balcony," said Clark. "One will lead us to the other." Valkyrie took out a tube of sun lotion and handed it to Clark while she studied the map. He shrugged and began applying it to her back. "I think I've got something," she said after a moment. "What's that?" asked Clark, starting on her legs. "If we can take a boat out," she said, "I can get a scope on that house and monitor their activity." "Yeah," said Clark, "but if they wonder why a boat's anchored in direct line of sight with that house, then we might see the shark men faster than we planned." "That's a good point," she said. "I don't think we're quite ready for a confrontation." "No," Clark agreed. "We're gathering info only. We don't engage unless we have to." "What about a clandestine insertion?" asked Gray Eagle. Clark glanced up at that. He'd been applying sunscreen to the back of Valkyrie's thighs. He saw her flick her eyes in his direction and smile. "One or two of us could slip inside their perimeter and get as close as we can to the house," said Gray Eagle. Wiping his hands on the beach towel, Clark picked up a stick and poked the map. "If we went in here," he said, pointing at the place just outside of town, "we could slip in without having to drive past the gate guards again. Another pass and I'm sure they'll make a move on us." "That depends, boss," said Runestone. "If they've got infrared sensors in the trees, you won't make it far. Or dogs. Dog will fuck up a recon faster than anything. We already know they have cameras. It's not a stretch to think they have infrared." "He's right," said Shield Maiden. "If I were planning a defense of that place, I'd have sensors and dogs. Especially if who we suspect is in that place is correct. They'll have the best defenses money can buy." "I never saw any indication of dogs," said Clark, "but that doesn't mean they're not there." "We could ask around," suggested Raven. "I'd bet that would get back to them before we found out anything significant," said Gray Eagle. "We have to assume that this town is fully infiltrated. They've been here since the end of World War II. They surely would have made friends here. If nothing else, the locals would know what would happen if they talked." "Shit," said Clark. "Getting in there might be tougher than I thought." "Well, we might not have to," said Valkyrie. "What do you have in mind?" asked Clark. "We go to a local bar," she said, grinning. "Those guards have to go somewhere when they're off duty. If they're anything like every other soldier in the world, they're going to want two things. Alcohol and pussy," said Runestone, grinning. "Crude, but he's not wrong," said Valkyrie, rolling her eyes. "So we find one and get him a drink," said Shield Maiden. "Soldiers blab all kinds of things when they're drunk." "So which one of you guys can hold your liquor the best?" asked Valkyrie. "Well, that would be me," said Gray Eagle. "No fucking way," said Runestone. "Ain't no damn Army Ranger gonna outdrink a SEAL." "That's not why," said Clark. "Alcohol doesn't affect him." "Oh, yeah?" said Runestone. "I forgot about the wolf thing. No offense meant by the Ranger crack." Gray Eagle smiled and chuckled softly. None taken, he replied. All right, said Clark. Let's pick a bar that hopefully has a few of those guards in it, and then let the games begin. When do we head back to town? Asked Raven. We'll stay here for a couple of more hours, said Clark. We don't want to get to the bars too early, and we want to give enough time before we pass that gate again. We want them to think we're just stupid tourists. Clark downed the rest of his beer and shoved it back into the ice, the tip of the bottle down. Then he pulled out a second one and opened it. Kicking his foot out, he destroyed the map and leaned back on the towel, placing his hand on Valkyrie's back. We've got company, he whispered. No one makes any sudden moves. Grey Eagle adjusted his posture and sniffed the air. 2 scents were heading their way. Both wore strong deodorant and used some type of scented soap. Runestone got onto his knees and grabbed the suntan lotion, getting ready to cover Raven's back. From his new position, he could see the men that had caught Clark's attention. 2 men, both wearing black ball caps with black T-shirts over blue jeans with black tactical boots. Both men wore dark sunglasses and walked like soldiers, instinctively falling into every step with each other as they approached. Clark leaned in close to Valkyrie, pretending to kiss her on the cheek. Instead, he whispered, I'll position myself where you can reach my pistol. You say the sexiest things to a girl, she replied, winking and sliding her hand under his shirt. She rubbed her hand up his back and then back down, resting it on the grip of the handgun. Clark smiled at her and then turned to face the 2 newcomers. Something I can do for you fellas? He asked as they stopped just behind the towels. Ja, said the one on the left. Are you the Americans who arrived in the old seaplane? Clark noted the German accent in his voice and could see the short-cropped blonde hair beneath the ball caps. That's us, said Clark. Where did you get that museum piece? Asked the man. I won it in a poker game in Borneo a few years back, said Clark, grinning. I restored it and now I travel all over with it. Would you entertain the idea of selling it? Asked the man. I don't think so, said Clark. Besides, even if I did, I wouldn't go cheap. My employer would like to pay whatever you ask, said the man. He's interested in it. He's something of a collector of vintage aircraft, specifically from that time period. Well, I'd have to think about it, said Clark. I have been instructed to invite you to dinner, said the man. He heard you were on your honeymoon and would like to have you join him for dinner at his estate in Almanco. He would, of course, welcome your friends as well. You can discuss your magnificent aircraft then. Clark glanced at Valkyrie and she met his gaze but kept a poker face. Shrugging, she smiled at him. It's up to you, she said. I know how much you love that plane. Well, we can at least hear him out, said Clark. I mean, it would be rude to refuse his hospitality. What time should we be there and how do we find it? On your way back to town, said the man. Watch the right side of the road. You will see a guarded gate before you get back to the village. That's the entrance. Security will be aware of you and escort you to the main house. Dinner is at 7. And if you prefer, we could send a car for you. Well, that would be fine, said Clark. Then we shall pick you up at 6:30, said the man. How should we dress? Asked Clark. I've never been invited to an estate for dinner. Dress formally, said the man. Jacket and tie at the very least. Tuxedo if you have one. If you didn't bring any formal wear, I'm certain he will understand. We'll be there, said Clark. Thank you, said the man. I'm certain he will be thrilled to know you accepted his invitation. We will see you at dinner. With that, the 2 men turned and walked away. Clark waited until they were getting back in their vehicle before he spoke. Does anyone else find that to be an odd coincidence? Asked Clark. They already know who we are, said Valkyrie. Or they're interested in that plane, finished Grey Eagle. One thing is certain, said Clark. There's no way they'll let us inside that place armed. Also, we need to get back to town. Why? Asked Valkyrie. We need to get to a tailor and see if they can do a rush job on tuxedos and dresses for all of us, said Clark. Suitably motivated, the girls gave up their sunbathing and gathered their supplies. They headed back to the SUV and only paused long enough to throw away the empty beer bottles. Putting the rest in the back, they all climbed inside and headed back into town. The two men who had approached them were at the gate when they drove by and waved at them. Clark waved back and motioned for Grey Eagle to slow down. The one who had done all the talking walked out to the road to speak with them. Clark noticed the guards all tighten their grip on their weapons. "We're going to head into town and see if we can get some suitable clothing," he said. "Can you recommend anyone who might be able to get it quick enough?" "Of course," the man said, smiling. "Go back to your hotel. Your concierge can have the people brought it to you. It should be no problem. Tell them you have been invited to dinner at El Naco. I'm certain that they will make sure that you are taken care of." "Thanks," said Clark. "We'll do that. We'll see you in a bit." Clark stuck his hand out to shake the man's hand, and he was surprised how tightly he gripped his hand. The man smiled as he firmly shook his hand. On his right bicep, Clark could make out a tattoo that had been covered until he lifted his arm to shake. It was a shield with a trident in the center. At the top were the letters M.E.K. "That's a cool tattoo," Clark said, nodding. "Thank you," said the man. "It's a unit tattoo from my time in the military." "Well, I'd love to hear about that," said Clark. "Perhaps tonight," said the man. "We can exchange stories over drinks. Were you in the military?" "Yes," said Clark. "U.S. Army. I served in Afghanistan and Iraq before I got out." "I would be very interested in hearing about your time in uniform," said the man. "My name is Eric Heinz. I look forward to exchanging stories." He released Clark's hand and did something completely unexpected. He clicked his heels together as he tipped his hat to the women. "Good day, ladies," he said, backing away from the SUV. Grey Eagle drove away, and they watched Heinz stare after them until they rounded the bend in the road. "Son of a bitch," said Clark. "He's the guy." "What do you mean?" asked Valkyrie. "Did you see his tattoo?" he asked. "Well, I heard you mention it," she replied, "but I didn't see it." "It was the same tattoo in the picture," said Clark. "The same tattoo on the arm of the creature that attacked the film crew." "I think we just got confirmation of the connection," said Grey Eagle. "Shit, get us back to the hotel. While they're getting our clothes ready, I need to call Allfather." Click the video on your screen for the next part of this audiobook. This has been Codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle, written by D.A Roberts, read to you by Cameron Buckner. Print copyright by D.A Roberts. Audio production copyright by Cameron Buckner. Reproduction of this audio is prohibited in any form without written approval under the U.S. copyright laws. Stay tuned to the Dixiecryptid podcast for more full-length audiobooks.